Before we begin, I want you to take a moment to look around you. We live in a world that never truly sleeps, a world of constant low-level noise. We live in a world of safety, of systems, of insurance policies and text messages. If someone wrongs you today, you file a complaint. You block them on social media. You call a lawyer. We have built layers and layers of soft, bureaucratic cotton wool to protect us from the jagged edges of other people. But tonight, for the next little while, I want you to peel all of that away. I want you to imagine that the electric hum fades into silence. The streetlights outside flicker and die, leaving a darkness so thick and heavy it feels like velvet against your skin. The walls of your room dissolve into the rough-hewn timber of a great hall, or the cold, damp stone of a castle keep. The air grows cooler, smelling faintly of wood smoke, wet wool, and old iron. Pull your blanket up a little higher. You are safe here, with my voice, but out there, beyond the circle of the firelight we are about to build in your imagination, the world is a very different place. Tonight, on Boring History, we are going to talk about the things that keep us awake at night. We are not here to discuss the dry shifting of borders on a map, or the economic impact of the grain trade in the 12th century. Those things are important, yes, but they are the shell of history. Tonight, we are interested in the yoke. We are interested in the blood that pumped through the veins of the people who lived in that darkness. We are talking about the cold, burning cold that sits in the deepest basement of the human heart. Revenge. Revenge is a word we use casually now. We say we'll get revenge on a friend by beating them in a video game. Or we talk about revenge bods after a breakup. We have diluted the word. We have made it safe. But in the medieval world, that vast, murky stretch of time between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Renaissance Renge was not a metaphor. It was an engine. It was a physical thing, as real as a sword in the hand or a coin in the purse. In a time before police forces, before DNA evidence, before international law, justice was not something the state gave you. Justice was something you had to take. If you didn't take it, you didn't have it. So, settle in. Let your breathing slow down. Match the rhythm of the shadows dancing on the wall. We are going to take a long, slow walk into the past to look at what happens when the human need for justice meets the absolute lack of rules. You see, history is often taught to us as a series of inevitable events. King A fought King B, and therefore country C was formed. It's presented as a chess game played by statues. But history wasn't lived by statues. It was lived by people who were just as petty, just as passionate, just as scared, and just as loving as you are. The only difference is that they lived with the volume turned all the way up. When we talk about the Middle Ages, we are talking about a time of extreme contrast. It was a world of breathtaking beauty, courthy cathedrals rising like stone lacework against the sky, stained glass fracturing light into 1,000 jewels, but it was also a world of breathtaking brutality. Life was short. Death was always standing in the corner of the room, waiting. Because life was so fragile, honor became the most valuable thing a person owned. Today, if someone insults you, it's annoying. In the year 1200, if someone insulted you, it was a threat to your survival. If you looked weak, you were prey. If you let a slight go unpunished, you weren't being the bigger person. You were painting a target on your back and the backs of your children. This is why the stories we are going to tell tonight are so intense. They aren't stories about people losing their tempers. They are stories about people trying to balance the scales of the universe. Think about the concept of the grudge. The word itself sounds heavy, doesn't it? Like a stone dragging on the ground. Grudge. In the medieval mind, a grudge wasn't just a bad feeling. It was an inheritance. If your father was killed by a rival family, you didn't just mourn him. You inherited his debt of blood. You could be born into a revenge story that started 50 years before you took your first breath. You were a character in a play that was already in the second act. This adds a layer of tragedy to everything we will discuss. These weren't just personal vendettas, they were duties. I want you to imagine the patience required for some of these stories. In our modern world, we want instant gratification. We want our food in 5 minutes, our movies on demand, and our justice immediately. If a crime happens, we want the suspect arrested by the evening news. But the people we will meet tonight possessed a terrifying kind of patience. They were willing to wait. Imagine hating someone, truly deeply hating them, for what they took from you and smiling at them across a banquet table for 10 years. Imagine watching their children grow up, watching them grow fat and happy, all while you are sharpening a knife in the back of your mind. That is a kind of discipline that we have largely lost. It is the discipline of the predator waiting in the tall grass. It is the silence of the spider in the web. Why do we find these stories so compelling? Why, when you are lying there in your warm bed, do you want to hear about betrayals and burnings? I think it is because, deep down, we all understand the impulse. We are civilized people, we follow the rules, we forgive and forget because that is what good people do. But there is a small, dark part of our brain, the lizard brain, the ancient brain that understands the satisfaction of the ledger being balanced. When we hear about a villain getting exactly what they deserve, it scratches a psychological itch. It feels like a chord resolving in a piece of music. It feels right. In the Middle Ages, they didn't repress that feeling. They built monuments to it. They wrote songs about it. The stories I have gathered for you tonight are the greatest hits of human spite, but they are also stories of love. That sounds strange, doesn't it? To say that revenge is a story of love, but the two are identical twins, separated at birth. You cannot have great revenge without great love. You don't burn down a city for a stranger. You don't spend a lifetime hunting down an enemy unless they took something you loved. Every act of violence we will discuss tonight is actually a twisted monument to grief. It is a scream of "you hurt me," and I will make sure the world never forgets it. As we prepare to drift through these 15 segments, I want to warn you, history is not a fairy tale. In fairy tales, the bad guys are ugly and the good guys are beautiful. In history, the lines are blurred. The heroes of our stories tonight are capable of monstrous things. They are innovative in their cruelty. They are artists of pain, but they are also human. They are mothers, husbands, poets, and kings. They are people who reached their breaking point and then kept going. Let's think for a moment about the setting of these stories. The medieval world. It is a world lit by fire. Imagine that. No light bulbs banishing the shadows. When the sun went down, the world shrank to the size of your candle flame. In that darkness, imagination ran wild. Rumors traveled faster than horses. A reputation for cruelty was a useful tool. If people feared you in the dark, they wouldn't attack you in the light. This is why the revenge had to be epic. It wasn't enough to just kill your enemy quietly in a ditch. You had to make a spectacle. You had to make it theater. You needed the peasants in the next village to whisper about what you did. You needed the bards to sing about it. You were broadcasting a message to the future. Do not cross me. This theatricality is what makes these stories so perfect for a bedtime narration. They feel like myths, but they are documented facts. The pain was real. The fire was hot. The winter was freezing. We will travel all over the map tonight. We will go to the icy rivers of Russia, where a widow teaches a lesson in diplomacy that involves being buried alive. We will sail the choppy, grey waters of the English Channel, where a woman paints her sails red to hide the blood. We will walk the sun-baked hills of Portugal to witness a coronation that is more horror than glory. We will ride across the endless grassy steppes of Mongolia, where an insult to a diplomat ends an entire civilization. And we will sit in a quiet, dusty room in Italy, where a man uses a pen to damn his enemies to hell forever. Each of these places has a different flavor, a different texture. It is a place where nature is not your friend. Nature is a titan that you have to wrestle for survival every single day. In this land, strength was the only currency that mattered. If you were weak, you were eaten sometimes by wolves, sometimes by your neighbors. At the center of this story is a woman named Olga. To understand Olga, you have to understand her position. She was not born a queen in a silk dress. She was a Viking woman, or of Viking descent. These were people who carved their names into history with axes. She was married to Prince Igor of Kiev. Now, Igor is complicated. In the history books, Igor often comes across as a man who was perhaps a little less intelligent than he was greedy. He was the Grand Prince, the ruler of Kiev, but he lacked the foresight of a great statesman. He treated his kingdom less like a nation to be governed, and more like a lemon to be squeezed. The year is 945 AD. It is winter. In the Kievan Rus, winter is not just a season. It is a siege. The snow piles up to the rooftops, and the world turns white and silent. This was the time for Polyodio, the going round. This was the annual tradition where the Grand Prince and his retinue of warriors would leave the comfort of Kiev and travel by sleigh to the various subject tribes to collect tribute. They would go from town to town, demanding furs, honey, wax, and slaves. It was a protection racket, plain and simple. Pay us, and we won't burn your village down. Pay us, and we will protect you from the other people who want to burn your village down. Igor set out that winter to visit a tribe called the Drevlians. The Drevlians were a forest people. Their name literally comes from the Slavic word for wood or tree. They were tough, independent, and notoriously stubborn. They had been paying tribute to Kiev for years, but they resented it. They were a proud people with their own prince, a man named Mao. When Igor arrived with his army, the Drevlians grumbled, but they paid. They handed over the furs, the silver, and the honey. They endured the insults of Igor's soldiers. They watched as the Kievans ate their food and drank their mead. And finally, after weeks of tension, Igor and his massive army packed up their sleighs and began the journey back home to Kiev. This is where the story pivots on a single moment of human greed. A few miles down the road, Igor stopped his sleigh. He looked at the pile of loot they had collected. It was a fortune. It was enough to keep him wealthy for a year. But as he sat there in the cold air, wrapped in his furs, a thought gnawed at him. Is it enough? He started thinking about the Drevlians back in their fortified town of Iskaristan. He thought about how they might have held something back. He thought about how easy it had been to take what he had. The greed whispered to him. Igor made a fatal decision. He turned to his army, thousands of men, and told the main force to continue on to Kiev with the loot. Then, he took a small retinue, perhaps a few dozen of his closest bodyguards and advisors, and turned his sleigh around. He decided to go back to the Drevlians. He wanted seconds. He wanted to double dip. He thought that because he was the Grand Prince, his title alone would protect him. He thought the Drevlians were sheep. He forgot that even sheep have horns. When the Drevlians saw Igor returning, not with an army, but with a handful of men, they held a council. The chronicle of bygone years tells us exactly what they said. It is a piece of folk wisdom that has echoed through the centuries. If a wolf enters the sheepfold, he will carry off the entire flock unless he is killed. They realized that Igor would never be satisfied. Today he wants more furs. Tomorrow he will want their children. There was only one solution. They couldn't pay him. They had to end him. The Drevlians swarmed out of their city. Igor's small retinue didn't stand a chance. They were overwhelmed, pulled from their horses and sleighs, and slaughtered in the snow. But for Igor, the Grand Prince, they reserved a special fate. They wanted to make an example of him. They wanted to show the world what happens when greed goes too far. We are told by the Byzantine historian Leo the Deacon that the Drevlians found two massive birch trees standing close together. Birch trees are flexible. They can bend a long way before they break. The Drevlians bent these two great trees down until their tops touched the ground. They tied the trees down with ropes. Then, they dragged Prince Igor to the center. They tied one of his legs to the first tree, and the other leg to the second tree. I want you to visualize the forest for a moment. The silence of the winter woods, the heavy breathing of the Drevlian warriors, the terrified screams of a prince who realizes, too late, that he is not a god. And then, at a signal from Prince Mal, a knife cut the ropes holding the trees down. The trees snapped back upright with the violence of a catapult. Igor was torn in half. It was a gruesome, visceral, instant death. His body was left there, a bloody warning in the treetops, and the Drevlians celebrated. They had killed the wolf. They were free, or so they thought. News travels slowly in the 10th century, but it does travel. Eventually, a battered survivor, or perhaps a terrified messenger, reached the gates of Kiev. They brought the news to Olga. Now, picture Olga. She is in the Great Hall of Kiev. She is a mother. Her son, Sviatoslav, is just a toddler, barely 3 years old. She is now a widow in a society that viewed women as property or political pawns. The death of her husband wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a political catastrophe. In the medieval world, when a king died and the heir was a child, the sharks would start to circle. The neighboring tribes would invade. The internal nobles would plot coups. The structure of the state would begin to crack. Most women in Olga's position would have fled. They would have taken the gold and the child and run to a monastery or back to Scandinavia. But Olga did not run. When she heard how her husband died torn apart like a rag doll, she did not scream. History records no hysteria. Instead, she went very, very quiet. It was the silence of a deep freeze. She understood immediately that if she showed even a single tear, a single moment of weakness, her son would be killed, and she would be deposed. She had to become something else. She had to become iron. Back in the land of the Drevlians, Prince Mal was feeling very confident. He had killed the great Igor. He felt invincible. His advisors came up with a bold, audacious plan. They said, "We have killed the husband. Now let us take the wife. They reasoned that if Prince Mao married Olga, he would become the stepfather to the young heir Svyatoslav. He would effectively become the ruler of Kiev. He would unite the Drevlian lands and the Kievan lands into one massive empire. It was a masterstroke of political ambition, but think about the arrogance of it. They had just butchered her husband in the most horrific way imaginable, and now they expected her to marry the murderer. They assumed that because she was a woman, she would need a protector. They assumed she would be desperate. They assumed she was just a piece on the board, waiting to be captured. So, the Drevlians selected their best men. This is a crucial detail. They didn't send just anyone. They chose 20 of their highest-ranking governors, their wisest elders, their most noble warriors. These were the elite. They dressed them in their finest robes, gave them a magnificent boat, and sent them down the Dnieper River to Kiev to propose marriage. When the boat arrived in Kiev, Olga was waiting. She knew they were coming. She had likely been watching the river for days, her mind sharpening like a whetstone. The Drevlian envoys docked their boat. They walked up to the court of Kiev, chests puffed out, acting like they already owned the place. They were brought before Olga. She sat on the throne, dressed in mourning black, her face unreadable. The Drevlians announced their mission. We have killed your husband, for he was like a wolf, plundering and ravening. But our princes are good, and they preserve the land. Marry our Prince Mao, and we will protect you. Olga looked at these men. She looked at the men who represented the tribe that had torn her husband in half, and then she smiled. It was a gentle, soft smile. She spoke to them in a voice that sounded like honey poured over ice. Your proposal is pleasing to me, she said. Indeed, my husband cannot rise from the dead. Can you imagine the relief the Drevlians felt? They must have looked at each other and nodded. See, women, they just want security. They thought they had one, but Olga continued. I wish to honor you tomorrow in the presence of my people. Return now to your boat and remain there. Show your pride. Tomorrow, when my people come to fetch you, say to them, we will not ride on horses, nor go on foot. Carry us in our boat, and you shall be carried in your boat, like kings. The Drevlians were thrilled. Being carried in a boat on land, it was a symbol of ultimate status. It meant they were so important, so powerful, that they didn't even have to touch the distinct dirt of Kiev. They returned to their boat, drank their wine, and slept the sleep of the victorious. But while they slept, Olga issued a quiet order. In the courtyard of the palace, under the cover of darkness, her soldiers began to dig. They didn't dig a grave. They dug a trench, a massive, deep, gaping pit. They worked silently, the shovels biting into the earth, throwing up piles of dirt. Olga lightly watched from a window, listening to the rhythm of the digging. Scrape, thud, scrape, thud. It was the rhythm of her revenge beginning to take shape. Morning came. The sun rose, pale and cold over the city. The Drevlians in the boat awoke, adjusted their fine robes, and combed their beards. Olga's messengers arrived at the riverbank, bowing low. The regent calls for you, the messengers said. The Drevlians, puffed up with pride, sat in their boat and repeated the lines Olga had fed them. We will not ride on horses, nor go on foot. Carry us in our boat. The people of Kiev who were in on the plan nodded. We are your slaves, they said mockingly, though the Drevlians didn't catch the tone. Our prince is dead, and our princess is willing to marry your prince. And so, the spectacle began. Dozens of strong Kievan soldiers lifted the heavy wooden boat onto their shoulders. The 20 Drevlian nobles sat inside, waving to the crowds, looking down on the people. They were being carried through the city like idols. They thought this was the greatest honor of their lives. They smiled, they laughed. They didn't notice that the route was leading them not to the banquet hall, but to the courtyard. They didn't notice the fresh pile of earth until it was too late. The procession entered the courtyard. The soldiers carrying the boat marched straight to the edge of the pit. And then, without a word, without a pause, they simply let go. The boat crashed down into the bottom of the deep trench. The timber cracked. The fine robes of the Drevlians were instantly soiled with mud. Bones were broken. The 20 best men of the Drevlian nation were suddenly tumbling over each other in a confused, terrified heap at the bottom of a dark hole. Before they could even catch their breath, before they could demand an explanation, the silhouette of a woman appeared at the edge of the pit. It was Olga. She looked down at them. She looked at the panic in their eyes. She looked at the men who had thought she was weak, the men who had thought she was a prize to be won. She leaned over, her face framed by the grey sky, and called down to them. Her voice was conversational, almost polite. "Is this honor to your taste?" she asked. The Drevlians began to scream. They begged. They pleaded. They realized, in that moment of absolute horror, that they had miscalculated everything. They weren't dealing with a widow. They were dealing with a warlord. Olga signaled to her men. They picked up their shovels, and they began to fill the hole. This wasn't a quick execution. This wasn't a beheading. This was burial alive. The dirt rained down on the Drevlians. At first, they tried to stand, to climb, but the boat trapped them, and the dirt kept coming. It filled their mouths when they screamed. It weighed down their arms. It covered the gold embroidery of their robes. The sound of their cries became muffled, then faint, and finally, silent. Olga stood there until the pit was level with the ground. She stood there until the earth was flat. She had just executed the entire diplomatic leadership of her enemy without drawing a sword. She had turned their symbol of honor, the boat, into their coffin. Most people would stop there. Most people would say, "Justice is done. They killed my husband. I killed their leaders. We are even." But you have to remember, we are talking about the most epic revenge stories. Olga wasn't done. She wasn't even close to being done. This was just the opening move. This was just the appetizer. She looked at the fresh dirt, and she knew that back in the Drevlian lands, Prince Mal was still waiting for news. He didn't know his ambassadors were dead. He didn't know the wedding was off. Olga turned to her scribes. "Write a letter," she said. She was going to send a message to Prince Mal. She was going to tell him that she accepted his proposal, but that the 20 men he sent weren't enough. She needed more. She needed the rest of his best men. She was going to drain his kingdom of every capable leader before she even marched her army out of Kiev. She was playing 4D chess, while the Drevlians were playing tic-tac-toe. As the sun set over Kiev that day, the ground in the courtyard was fresh and dark. Underneath it lay the first installment of her payment. Olga went back into her palace, back to her son. She probably brushed his hair, fed him his supper, and tucked him into bed. The perfect mother, the perfect ruler, the saint who was just warming up. But that is a story for the next segment. For now, let the image of that boat, sinking into the earth, linger in your mind. Think of the silence that followed. Think of the cold. And remember, never, ever underestimate someone just because they are grieving. Grief burns, and sometimes it burns everything down. Here is the expanded script for segment 3, continuing our journey into the dark. This segment focuses on the second act of Olga's revenge, the bathhouse. It is written with the same immersive, atmospheric, and hypnotic tone, designed to paint a vivid picture of hospitality turned into a nightmare. The earth in the courtyard of Kiev was fresh. It was a scar on the land, a dark patch of overturned soil that hid a terrible secret. Underneath that dirt lay 20 men, the finest ambassadors of the Drevlian nation, silenced forever along with their boat. But above ground, life in the castle went on. The wind blew, the servants hurried about their chores, and the snow began to fall again, slowly covering the evidence in a pristine white blanket. Olga stood at her window, looking out at that white patch. To anyone else, it looked like winter. To her, it looked like progress. But she knew that her work was not done. In fact, it had barely begun. You see, revenge is a hungry beast. It is not satisfied with a single meal. The 20 men she had buried were important, yes, but they were not enough. They were merely the messengers. The head of the Snake Prince Mal and the high nobles who commanded the armies still lived. They sat in their wooden halls in Iskorosten, drinking wine and toasting to their own cleverness, oblivious to the fact that their envoys were currently decomposing in a trench in Kiev. So, Olga went to her desk. She took a quill, dipped it in ink, and composed a letter. I want you to imagine the steadiness of her hand. Most of us, if we had just buried 20 people alive, would be shaking. We would be terrified of discovery. We would be paralyzed by guilt. But Olga wrote with the calm precision of an accountant balancing a ledger. She wrote to the Drevlians, and she lied with the beauty of a poet. I am pleased with your proposal. However, if I am to leave my people and come to you to be your queen, I require more honor. The people of Kiev will not let me go easily. Send me your most distinguished menure, governors, your mayors, your wealthiest merchants to escort me. Only then will my people see that you are worthy of me, and only then will I come to you with joy. She handed the letter to a messenger and sent him galloping north. Now, let us travel with that messenger to the land of the Drevlians. He saw a political alliance that would make him the most powerful man in the region. He read the request for more distinguished men not as a threat, but as vanity. Of course, he thought, she is a princess. She wants a parade. She wants to be courted with pomp and circumstance. It is a fatal flaw in human nature. We often mistake the silence of our enemies for submission. These were the administrators, the generals, the wise old men who knew the laws. He told them to pack their bags. He told them to put on their best furs, their heaviest gold chains, their finest boots. He told them they were going to Kiev to pick up a bride. Can you imagine the mood of that caravan as they left the city? It must have been festive. They were riding to a wedding. They laughed, they joked, they dreamed of the feast that awaited them. They didn't know they were riding into the throat of a dragon. By the time the Drevlian delegation arrived in Kiev, they were exhausted. They were covered in the dust of the road. Their beards were matted, their skin grimy, their muscles aching from days in the saddle. And they got one. Olga met them at the entrance to the city. She was the picture of grace. She bowed her head. She welcomed them as honored guests. She looked into the eyes of the men who had plotted her husband's death, and she offered them water. She played the role of the submissive, eager bride, so perfectly that not a single one of them suspected a thing. "You must be tired from your journey," Olga said, her voice soft and caring. "The road is hard, and the dust lies heavy on you. Before you come to the feast, before you meet my court, you must refresh yourselves. I have prepared the bathhouse for you. Go, wash, relax, and steam away the weariness of travel. Then, come to me, and we shall celebrate the bathhouse." In Slavic culture, the banyan, the bathhouse, is a sacred place. It is not just a place to get clean. It is a place of ritual. It is where women gave birth. It is where the dead were washed before burial. It is a place where the four elements meet: earth in the stones, water in the steam, air in the heat, and fire in the furnace. It is a place of vulnerability. To enter the bathhouse, you must strip away your armor, your weapons, your clothes, and your rank. You enter as just a human being, naked and soft. The Drevlians were delighted. A hot bath after a week of freezing travel. It sounded like heaven. They nodded eagerly and followed Olga's servants to the bathhouse. Let's visualize this building. It was likely a large, wooden structure, built from heavy logs, caulked with moss to keep the heat in. It would have a low door, forcing you to bow as you entered. Inside, there would be benches of smooth wood, and a great stone stove where a fire had been roaring for hours, heating the rocks until they glowed. The Drevlian nobles entered. They undressed. They piled their expensive furs in the corner. They laid aside their swords and their daggers. They stepped into the steam room, the heat wrapping around them like a warm blanket. They splashed water on the hot stones his sand. The steam rose up, thick and white, smelling of birch leaves and wet wood. They sat on the benches, sighing with relief, letting the heat penetrate their bones. They began to scrub the road dirt from their skin. They felt safe. They felt clean. Outside, the air was crisp and cold. Olga stood by the door. She listened to the sounds from inside: the splash of water, the low murmur of voices, the laughter of men who thought they had won the game of life. She gestured to her soldiers. They moved with the silence of ghosts. They didn't draw swords. They didn't shout. They simply walked up to the heavy wooden door of the bathhouse and closed it. Then, they dropped the heavy iron bar across the outside. Thud. The sound must have been audible inside. Perhaps one of the Drevlians looked up, confused. Did the wind blow the door shut? He might have asked. Perhaps someone went to check, pushing against the wood, only to find it unyielding. Outside, Olga gave the second order. Her men brought torches. They brought bundles of dry straw and kindling. They piled the straw against the wooden walls of the bathhouse. The logs of the building were old and dry. They had been seasoned by years of heat from the inside and sun from the outside. They were tinder waiting for a spark. Olga watched as the first torch was lowered. Fire is a terrifying thing. It is alive. It breathes. It eats. When the straw caught, it didn't just burn. It roared. The flames licked up the sides of the bathhouse, finding the cracks between the logs, feeding on the moss. Inside, the confusion turned to panic. The Drevlians realized they were trapped. They pounded on the door. "Open up. Is anyone there? The door is stuck." but the only answer was the crackle of the fire. The temperature inside the bathhouse, already hot from the steam, began to skyrocket. Smoke began to seep through the cracks, choking and thick. The relaxing steam turned into a suffocating cloud. The men, naked and defenseless, scrambled away from the walls as the wood began to glow orange from the outside in. I want you to think about the horror of that moment. These were powerful men. In their own lands, their word was law. They commanded armies. They owned vast estates. But in that small wooden room, stripped of their clothes and their weapons, they were powerless. They were not governors or generals anymore. They were just biological matter, trapped in an oven. The fire climbed the roof. The thatch caught instantly, sending a plume of smoke high into the grey winter sky. The noise would have been deafening. The roar of the flames, the snapping of timber, and the screams of the men inside. Olga stood there. Their inhabitants are cultivating their fields and lands in peace, but you are determined to die of hunger, refusing to pay tribute. The Drevlians shouted down from the walls. We would be glad to pay tribute, but you want revenge for your husband. We know what you did at the feast. Olga's reply is a masterclass in gaslighting. She called up to them, her voice sounding weary, like a woman who is just tired of all the fighting. I have already revenged the death of my husband, she said. I revenged him when your envoys came to Kiev, and again at the funeral feast. I do not desire further revenge. I am tired of blood. I am prepared to accept a small tribute and go home. I just want peace. The Drevlians were suspicious. What tribute? They asked. They expected her to ask for gold, silver, slaves, or furs. Olga smiled. I know you are impoverished by the siege, she said. I do not wish to burden you. Give me something small. Give me, let's see. Give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house. The Drevlians looked at each other. Birds. She wants birds. It seemed ridiculous. It seemed like the whim of an eccentric woman. Maybe she wanted them for a sacrifice. Maybe she wanted them for food. They didn't care. Compared to gold or slaves, birds were free. They were vermin. If catching a few pigeons would make this terrifying army go away, they would do it gladly. They laughed at her foolishness. They felt relieved. She is just a woman after all, they probably said. She has no stomach for a long war. So, the people of Iskaristan opened their coops. They climbed into the eaves of their houses. They caught the pigeons that cooed on their roofs and the sparrows that nested in their thatch. They gathered thousands of birds in cages and sent them out to Olga's camp with a message of submission. Olga accepted the birds. She thanked the Drevlians. Now, she said, go back to your city. Sleep well. Tomorrow, I will withdraw my army and go home. The Drevlians went back inside their walls. That night, there was celebration in Iskaristan. The siege was over. They had survived. They ate, they drank, and they went to sleep, secure in their wooden houses, under their dry, thatched roofs. But in Olga's camp, no one was sleeping. As the sun set and the sky turned a bruised purple, Olga issued her command. She had her soldiers take small pieces of cloth. She had them soak the cloth in sulfurous substance that burns hot and slow. She had them tie these little fire starters to the legs of the pigeons and the sparrows with long, thin threads. Can you see the scene? Thousands of soldiers, holding thousands of terrified, fluttering birds, tying death to their feet, the air smelling of sulfur and anticipation. When the night was fully dark, Olga raised her hand. Release them, she whispered. The soldiers lit the sulfur. The cloth began to smolder and spark. Then, they threw the birds into the air. Now, think about the biology of a bird. When a bird is released, where does it go? It doesn't fly into the dark unknown. It goes home. It goes to the nest it knows. And where were the nests of these birds? They were under the eaves of the houses in Iskaristan. They were in the haylofts. They were in the thatched roofs of the barns. The sky filled with thousands of tiny, moving stars. It must have looked beautiful for a moment, a river of sparks flowing upwards and over the walls of the city. But then, the stars landed. The birds flew straight back to their nests. They tucked themselves into the dry hay and the straw roofs, seeking safety. The burning sulfur ignited the tinder-dry thatch instantly. It didn't start as one fire. That is the genius of it. It started as 1,000 fires, all at the exact same moment. 1 minute, the city was dark and sleeping. The next, every single house, every barn, every shed burst into flames simultaneously. The city didn't just burn, it erupted. The people of Iskaristan woke up in hell. There was nowhere to run. If they ran out of their houses, the street was on fire. If they ran to the neighbor's house, it was on fire too. The heat would have been instantaneous and overwhelming. The oxygen was sucked out of the air. The roar of the flames would have drowned out the screams. Olga stood on a hill outside the city. She watched the city of her enemies turn into a torch. She watched the walls that had defied her crumble into ash. As the people fled the burning city, running out of the gates with their clothes smoking, they ran straight into Olga's waiting army. There was no mercy. The chronicle tells us that she took the elders of the city and burned them. Others were captured and given as slaves to her followers. The rest were left to inhabit the ruins and pay a heavy tribute. Iskristan was gone. The Drevlians were broken. The debt was paid. Olga rode back to Kiev. She had completed one of the most brutal, calculated, and thorough revenge cycles in human history. She had used earth, the burial, water, the bathhouse, steam, and fire, the birds. She had dismantled an entire tribe to avenge one man. And here is the strange, final twist of the story. Years later, Olga converted to Christianity. She was the first ruler of the Rus to do so. She traveled to Constantinople, debated with the emperor, and was baptized. Her grandson, Vladimir the Great, would eventually convert the entire nation, leading to the Russian Orthodox Church. Because of her conversion and her efforts to bring Christianity to the pagan lands, the Church canonized her. She is Saint Olga. Her title is equal to the Apostles. She is the patron saint of widows and converts. There is a profound irony in that. The woman who buried men alive, who burned them in bathhouses, who massacred them at a funeral, and who incinerated a city using birds, is a saint. It reminds us that history is not a moral fable. It is a messy, bloody, complicated thing. In the medieval world, you could be a mass murderer on Tuesday and a saint on Sunday. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, think of the birds, think of the pigeons on the roof. They seem so harmless, don't they? But in the hands of the wrong person, or perhaps the right person, even the smallest, gentlest things can become weapons of mass destruction. Olga's story teaches us that true revenge is not about anger. Anger is hot and fast. It burns out. True revenge is cold. It is creative, and it is patient. We leave the smoking ruins of Iskristan behind us now. The wind blows the ash away. We travel west, away from the snows of Russia, towards the salt spray of the Atlantic Ocean. Our next story takes us to the deck of a ship, where a different kind of widow is waiting. She doesn't have birds, she has an axe, and she paints her sails red. Here is the expanded script for segment 5. We now leave the frozen earth of Russia behind. The scent of pine and burning birch fades, replaced by the sharp, stinging smell of salt spray and the roar of the Atlantic Ocean. We are traveling west, to the rugged, wind-battered peninsula of Brittany in France. Can you hear it? The sound of the sea. Imagine the coast of Brittany. It is not a gentle coastline. It is a place of violence where the ocean attacks the land. The rocks are black and jagged, like broken teeth biting into the Atlantic. The sky is often a bruised purple or a heavy, wet grey. The wind here doesn't just blow, it howls. It strips the leaves from the trees and the mercy from the human heart. It is a landscape that breeds tough people. It is the mid-14th century. We are in the early years of one of the longest, messiest conflicts in human history, the 100 Years' War. It was a time when England and France were locked in a slow-motion wrestling match that would burn for generations. But within that great war, there were smaller, nastier wars, civil wars, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. In this chaotic world, we find a woman named Jeanne de Clisson. Before she was a pirate, before she was a monster to the French crown, she was simply a noblewoman. And by all accounts, she was a woman who had it all. She was born Jeanne de Belleville, a woman of high birth, immense beauty, and iron will. She was not a shrinking violet. She was a woman who managed estates, who understood money, and who walked with the confidence of someone who knows exactly who they are. She was married to a man named Olivier de Clisson, and this is important. She loved him. In the Middle Ages, marriage was usually a business transaction. You traded a daughter for a castle, or a son for a treaty. Love was an accident, a luxury that most nobles didn't expect. But Jeanne and Olivier were different. They were a power couple. They were wealthy, they were respected, and they were partners. They had 5 children together. They lived in a magnificent castle in Clisson, a fortress that stood over the river Sever Nantes like a stone sentinel. Life, for Jeanne, should have been a series of banquets, hunts, and raising children. It should have been a life of velvet and wine. But history had other plans. The trouble began with the War of the Breton Succession. It's a dry name for a bloody affair. Essentially, two different noble houses were fighting over who got to be the Duke of Brittany. One side was backed by England, the other side was backed by France. Olivier de Clisson served the French side. He fought for Charles of Blois, the French king's choice. He was a loyal soldier. He defended the city of Vannes against the English with everything he had. But in the medieval world, loyalty was a slippery thing. During the siege of Vannes, the English captured Olivier. This was normal in medieval warfare. Noblemen were valuable. You didn't kill them, you ransomed them. The English held Olivier for a while, and then, surprisingly, they released him for a very low ransom. This was suspicious. Why would the English let a powerful French commander go for pennies? Whispers began to circulate in the French court. The poison of rumor started to drip into the ear of the King of France, Philip VI. Why was the ransom so low? The courtiers whispered. Perhaps Olivier made a deal with the English king. Perhaps he is not as loyal as he seems. Perhaps he is planning to switch sides. King Philip VI was not a secure man. He was a king plagued by doubts, fighting a war that was draining his treasury. Paranoia is the occupational hazard of kings, and Philip had a severe case of it. He began to believe the lies. He convinced himself that Olivier de Clisson, one of his most powerful lords, was a traitor. But Philip didn't act like a king. He didn't summon Olivier to a trial. He didn't ask for proof. He acted like a coward. The year is 1343. King Philip announces a great tournament in Paris, a celebration of chivalry, a festival of jousting and feasting to celebrate the truce between England and France. He sends out invitations to the great lords of Brittany, including Olivier de Clisson. Imagine the scene at the castle in Clisson when the invitation arrived. Olivier probably saw it as an honor. The king wants me in Paris, he might have told Jean. This is a chance to clear my name, to show my loyalty, to shine in the capital. Jean, perhaps, helped him pack. She might have selected his finest tunic. She might have kissed him goodbye at the castle gate, watching him ride off with his retinue, the sun glinting on their armor. She had no way of knowing she was watching a dead man ride away. Olivier arrived in Paris. The city was bustling. Banners waved from the rooftops. The streets smelled of roasting meat and unwashed crowds. But the moment Olivier and his fellow Breton lords entered the city, the trap snapped shut. There was no tournament for them. There was no feast. King Philip's guards seized Olivier. They dragged him to the Châtelet, the dark, formidable prison of Paris. There was no jury. There were no witnesses. The king simply declared that Olivier was a traitor. The trial was a farce, a piece of paper signed in the dark. On August 2nd, 1343, Olivier de Clisson was led out to Les Halles, the central market of Paris. It was a public execution. The crowd gathered, expecting a spectacle, and they got one. The executioner struck. Olivier was beheaded, but the insult didn't stop with death. In the Middle Ages, the body was sacred. To desecrate a body was to deny the person peace in the afterlife. King Philip ordered Olivier's body to be hung on a gibbet, a wooden structure usually reserved for common criminals, thieves, and murderers. This was a supreme humiliation for a nobleman. And then, Philip did something that would seal his own fate, though he didn't know it yet. He ordered Olivier's head to be dipped in tar to preserve it, and sent it to the city of Nantes in Brittany. There, he had the head impaled on a pike and displayed on the top of the soft-out gate, facing the road. He wanted it to be a warning. He wanted the people of Brittany to look up and see the rotting face of Olivier de Clisson, and think, this is what happens when you cross the King of France. He expected fear. What he got was the birth of a demon. Let us return to Jean. She is at home in her castle, waiting for news of the tournament. She expects stories of jousts and glory. Instead, a messenger arrives. He is likely covered in sweat, pale and trembling. He brings the news that shatters her world. Your husband is dead, my lady. The king has murdered him. His body hangs like a thief in Paris, and his head is on a spike in Nantes. I want you to pause and sit with that moment. The silence in the great hall, the servants freezing in their tracks, the sound of a log shifting in the fireplace. Most people would break. Grief is a heavy wave. It knocks you down, it rolls you over, it drowns you. Jean surely felt that wave. She must have screamed. She must have fallen to her knees. This was the man she loved, the father of her children, gone, not in battle, which she could have accepted, but by treachery, by a lie. But then, the wave receded, and what was left on the beach of her soul was not sadness. It was something hard, something sharp, like black glass. Jean de Clisson stood up. She dried her eyes. She didn't hide in her room. She didn't go to a nunnery to pray for his soul. She made a decision that defied every social norm of the 14th century. She gathered her 2 young sons, Olivier and Guillaume. They were just boys, perhaps 7 and 9 years old. She put them in a carriage. "Come," she said, "we are going to see your father." She traveled to Nantes. She rode to the Sauvetout gate, and there she made her children look up. They saw the head of their father. The tar made his skin look black. The birds had likely begun to peck at it. It was a grotesque, nightmarish sight. It was a sight that would traumatize a child for life. But Jean forced them to look. She burned that image into their retinas. "Look," she told them. "Look at what the King of France has done. Look at what loyalty gets you. Never forget this face. Never forgive." She stood beneath that pike, and she swore an oath. It wasn't a whisper. It was a promise screamed at the sky. She swore that she would make King Philip pay for every drop of Olivier's blood. She swore she would not rest until the French nobility bled, as her husband had bled. But oaths are cheap. Anyone can swear revenge. The question was, how could a widow, stripped of her husband's income, declared a traitor's wife, possibly hurt the King of France? Jean went back to her lands. The king, in his arrogance, had banished her and confiscated Olivier's property. He thought that by taking her money, he was taking her power. He expected her to fade away into poverty. He was wrong. Jean was a wealthy woman in her own right. She had her own inheritance, her own lands from her family, the de Belvilles, and she had something else. She had charisma. When the lords of Brittany heard what the king had done, the shame of the execution, the head on the gate, they were disgusted. They rallied to her. She sold everything. I want you to imagine the estate sale of the century. She sold her jewelry, the rubies, the pearls, the gold chains. She sold the furniture. She sold the tapestries. She liquidated her entire life. She turned her heritage into a mountain of gold coins. And with that gold, she didn't buy a safe house in England. She didn't buy a pardon. She went to the shipyards. She hired the best shipwrights in Brittany. "Build me ships," she ordered. "Not merchant ships, not fishing boats. Build me killers." She commissioned 3 warships. But she wasn't content with them just being ships. She wanted them to be symbols. She wanted them to be nightmares. She ordered the hulls to be painted black, pitch black, the color of death, the color of the void. And the sails, she ordered the sails to be dyed red, a deep, blood red, the color of violence, the color of the executioner's hood. She christened the flagship My Revenge. It sounds like fiction, doesn't it? It sounds like a comic book character. The Black Fleet, the red sails. But this was real. This was a woman channeling her grief into branding. She wanted the French sailors to see those red sails on the horizon and know, instantly, that they were going to die. She hired a crew, but she didn't just hire sailors. She hired cutthroats. She hired men who had no love for the French king, Bretons, outlaws, mercenaries. She gathered a small army of the dispossessed, and she, the noblewoman who had once hosted banquets and danced in silk, put on armor. She strapped a sword to her hip. She took the helm of My Revenge. Her target was not just any ship. She wasn't a common pirate looking for gold. She didn't care about cargo. She threw silk into the sea. She burned spices. She was hunting French flags. Specifically, ships that belonged to King Philip or his loyal nobles. The first time her fleet sailed out of the harbor, the grey Atlantic waves crashing against the black holes. It must have been a terrifying sight. Jean stood on the deck, the wind whipping her hair, her sons standing beside her. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was the lioness of Brittany. The transformation was complete. The grieving widow had died in front of the Sauvetout gate in Nantes. What had risen in her place was a warlord of the sea, and the King of France. He was sitting in his palace in Paris, perhaps drinking wine, perhaps worrying about the English. He had forgotten about the widow d'Éclisson. He thought she was a loose end that had been tied up. He didn't know that on the western horizon a storm was gathering, a storm with red sails, a storm that was coming specifically for him. But the details of her campaign, the blood, the axe, and the 13-year reign of terror, that is a story for the next segment. For now, visualize that fleet leaving the harbor, the creak of the wood, the snap of the red canvas, the cold determination in a woman's eyes. She is leaving behind the land that betrayed her. She is casting off from the shore of civilization. She is sailing into the darkness, and she is bringing the fire with her. The ocean is vast and deep and hides many things, but it could not hide the hate of Jean d'Éclisson. We are now deep in the cold waters of the English Channel. The land is gone. The rules of civilization are gone. We are aboard the flagship of the Black Fleet, standing beside a woman who has traded her silk for steel. This is the heart of the storm. Let us drift now, away from the safety of the shore, out into the vast, heaving grey of the Atlantic Ocean. The year is 1344. The English Channel is a dangerous place. It is a narrow strip of water separating two kingdoms that hate each other, a highway of war where merchant ships, troop transports, and fishing vessels play a deadly game of cat and mouse. The weather here is notoriously cruel. Fog rolls in thick and sudden, blinding sailors in a wall of white. The waves can rise like mountains, smashing timber to splinters. It is a graveyard of ships, but in this particular year, French sailors are not looking at the sky for storms. They are not worrying about the jagged rocks of the coast. They are scanning the horizon for something far more specific and far more terrifying. They are looking for a color. Imagine standing on the deck of a French supply ship. You are carrying grain and wine to the king's army in Normandy. The sea is calm. The seagulls are crying overhead. It seems like a peaceful day. And then, the lookout in the crow's nest screams. He points to the west, where the sun is dipping low. Out of the mist, three shapes emerge. They are ships, but they look like shadows cut from the night itself. Their hulls are painted pitch black, not the dark brown of treated wood, but a true abyssal black that seems to absorb the light. And above these black holes rise the sails. They are not the white canvas of honest merchants. They are dyed a deep, violent scarlet. The Black Fleet has found you. The panic on the French ship would have been absolute. By now, the rumors have spread in every tavern from Calais to Bordeaux. Everyone knows who commands those ships. Everyone knows that the Lioness of Brittany, Jeanne de Clisson, is not looking for cargo. She is looking for blood. This brings us to the core of Jeanne's revenge. It wasn't just about killing. It was about the performance of killing. It was about terror. For 13 years, let that sink in. 13 years Jeanne de Clisson waged a private war against the French monarchy. Most revenge stories burn out quickly. Anger is a high-energy emotion. It is hard to sustain. But Jeanne's anger was different. It was a cold fusion reactor. It was sustainable energy. She patrolled the channel with the relentless discipline of a machine. Let's visualize the moment of attack. The Black Fleet was fast. Jeanne had spent her fortune well. These ships were sleek, designed for speed and maneuverability. Unlike the heavy, lumbering French supply cogs, the black ships would close the distance rapidly. The French sailors would scramble to arm themselves, grabbing pikes and rusty swords. But they were merchant sailors, not warriors. They were fighting for a paycheck. Jeanne's crew was fighting for something darker. Her crew is worth mentioning. Who were these men? They were the outcasts of Brittany. They were men whose homes had been burned by the French army during the Succession Wars. They were criminals, exiles, and mercenaries who had seen the head of Olivier de Clisson on that pike and felt the same rage as his widow. They were loyal to Jeanne, not just because she paid them, though she did, with the loot she took, but because she was a force of nature. They called her the Lioness. To serve her was to serve the avenging angel of Brittany itself. The ships would collide with a sickening crunch of timber. Grappling hooks, scion claws on long ropes would be thrown across the gap, biting into the wood of the French ship, locking the two vessels together in a deadly embrace. And then, the boarding. Jeanne led from the front. This is a detail that history insists upon. She didn't sit in her cabin while her men did the dirty work. She was on the deck. Imagine this woman, a former high society noblewoman who used to worry about embroidery and court etiquette, now clad in mail armor, a sword in her hand, storming the deck of a French ship. The sheer cognitive dissonance of seeing a lady of the court screaming a war cry and cutting down sailors must have paralyzed her enemies. The battles were usually short. The French merchants were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the Bretons. The decks would become slick with blood, making footing treacherous. The air would fill with the metallic temps of copper and the screams of the dying. But the true horror began after the fighting stopped. When the French ship was secured and the surviving crew had surrendered, most pirates would do one of two things. They would either ransom the wealthy prisoners and let the rest go, or they would press the sailors into service. Pirates were businessmen, after all. Jeanne was not a businessman. She was an executioner. She would have the French prisoners lined up on the deck. She would walk down the line, looking at them. She was looking for noblemen. She was looking for anyone with a crest, a signet ring, or a fine coat, anyone who represented the class of people who had stood by and watched her husband die. and then the lioness would bare her claws. Legend and several historical chronicles tell us that Jeanne would personally behead the French aristocrats. She didn't delegate this task to a headsman. She wanted to feel the weight of the axe in her own hands. She wanted to see the light go out in their eyes. For every stroke of the axe, perhaps she saw the face of King Philip. For every head that rolled on the deck, she was mentally removing the head of her husband from that spike in Nantes. It was a ritual of grief, played out in blood, over and over again. But here is the most chilling detail, the one that elevates this story from simple slaughter to psychological warfare. Jeanne never killed everyone. If she captured a ship with 30 men, she might kill 27 of them. But she would always pick 2 or 3 survivors. Usually, she would pick the lowest-ranking sailors, a cabin boy, a cook, a simple deckhand. She would leave them alive, trembling in the blood of their captain. Why? Because dead men tell no tales. If a ship simply disappears in the ocean, it's a mystery. Maybe it hit a rock. Maybe a storm took it. The king could write it off as bad luck. Jeanne didn't want to be bad luck. She wanted to be a message. She would drag these terrified survivors to the rail of the ship. She would point her bloodied sword at them and give them a message to deliver. Go to Paris. She would say, go to King Philip. Tell him who did this. Tell him that the wife of Olivier de Clisson sends her regards. Tell him that the sea belongs to me, and that no Frenchman is safe as long as I draw breath. Then, she would put them in a small rowboat and set them adrift. Imagine being that survivor. You row back to the coast of France, traumatized, covered in the blood of your friends. You stumble ashore. You are brought before the local magistrate, and eventually, your story makes its way up the chain of command to the Louvre Palace in Paris. King Philip VI sits on his throne. A trembling sailor is brought in. The sailor tells the king about the black ships. He tells the king about the red sails. He tells the king about the beautiful, terrifying woman who chops off heads with an axe. She said it was for Olivier. The sailor whispers. Can you imagine the chill that must have gone down the king's spine? Kings are used to fighting armies. They are used to fighting other kings. They are not used to fighting ghosts. They are not used to fighting the consequences of their own cruelty coming back to haunt them. Jeanne de Clisson was a problem he couldn't solve with a treaty or a marriage. She was a rogue element. She was pure chaos. This went on for 13 years. The Black Fleet became the scourge of the French Navy. They disrupted supply lines. They sank warships. They raided coastal villages in Normandy, burning them to the ground and leaving nothing but ash and the legend of the lioness. Jeanne's success wasn't just due to her rage. It was due to her alliances. Remember, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The King of England, Edward III, was delighted by this turn of events. He saw Jeanne as a fantastic asset, a French noblewoman tearing apart the French Navy from the inside. It was perfect. The English began to support her. When her black ships needed repairs, they docked in English ports. When she needed arrows, food, or fresh water, the English provided it. The Lioness of Brittany became a semi-official part of the English naval effort. The Countess of Clisson was treated as a hero in London, even as she was painted as a demon in Paris. There is a fascinating historical footnote here about her children. Her sons, Olivier and Guillaume, were on the ship with her. They grew up on the deck of My Revenge. They didn't have tutors or play with wooden horses. Their childhood was the roar of the ocean and the swing of the axe. They watched their mother transform into a warlord. Tragically, the younger son Guillaume died during these years. Life at sea is hard, wet, and cold. The exposure was too much for a child. He died not by a sword, but by the elements. When Guillaume died, Jeanne's rage likely doubled. Now, the French king wasn't just responsible for the death of her husband. He was responsible for the death of her son, who had been forced into this life of exile because of the king's injustice. Every French ship she sank after that was an offering to her lost boy. The sheer scale of her operation is staggering. We are not talking about a few raids. We are talking about a strategic blockade of the French coast, maintained by a private citizen. She became so dangerous that the French Parliament passed a decree specifically mentioning her, judging her as a traitor, and confiscating every last scrap of land she had left in France, though she had long since sold it all. King Philip VI died in 1350. He died knowing that he had failed to stop her. He died knowing that the woman he had wronged was still out there, sailing the seas, laughing at his authority. He had thought that killing Olivier would secure his power. Instead, it had created his greatest nightmare. Jeanne outlived him. She outlived the man who ruined her life. And for a while, Even after Philip died, she kept sailing. The machine of revenge was hard to turn off. The momentum of hate is a powerful thing, but eventually, the fire begins to consume the fuel. The ocean is exhausting. The killing is exhausting. And perhaps, after Philip died, the satisfaction began to wane. The target was gone. The person she hated was dead. Now she was just fighting a kingdom, and kingdoms are abstract concepts. You can't behead a kingdom. The legend of the Lioness of Brittany teaches us something profound about the medieval mind. It shows us that chivalry, that code of honor and protection, was often a lie. Chivalry didn't protect Olivier from a sham trial. Chivalry didn't protect a widow from being dispossessed. When the system failed her, Jean didn't try to fix the system. She stepped outside of it entirely. She became something primal. She proved that in the 14th century, a woman's place was wherever she wanted it to be, even if that place was standing in a pool of blood on the deck of a warship, holding an axe. But no storm lasts forever. The clouds must eventually break. The waves must eventually settle. For Jean, the time eventually came to put down the sword. She had balanced the ledger. She had screamed her grief to the heavens for over a decade. So, how does a pirate queen retire? Where does the lioness go when the hunt is over? Does she die in battle, going down with her ship in a blaze of glory? Does she get captured and executed? No, that would be the expected ending. That would be the tragic ending. But Jean de Clisson was not a tragedy. She was a triumph. Her ending is perhaps the most surprising part of the whole story. It involves a quiet house, a new husband, and a warm bed. It involves peace, but that is the conclusion we will reach in the next segment. For now, stay on that deck one last moment. Feel the spray of the ocean. Look at the red sails flapping in the wind, stained with the memory of violence. Understand that for 13 years, the most feared captain in Europe was a mother who simply missed her husband. The horizon is clearing. The coast of England is coming into view. The Black Fleet is preparing to dock for the last time. Welcome to Portugal. The year is 1340. It is a time when the Iberian Peninsula is a chessboard of kingdoms. Castile, Portugal, Aragon, all vying for power, all tangled in a web of marriages and alliances. In this world, we meet Dom Pedro. He is the Infante, the heir to the Portuguese throne. He is young, he is passionate, and by all accounts, he is a man who feels things too deeply. He is not the cold, calculating politician his father is. His father, King Afonso IV, is a man of the state. Afonso sees the world in terms of borders, treaties, and gold. Pedro sees the world in terms of poetry and pulse. As is the custom for princes, Pedro's life was mapped out for him before he could even read. He was a piece of diplomatic currency. His father arranged a marriage for him with Constanza Manuel, a noblewoman from the powerful kingdom of Castile. It was a perfect match on paper. It secured the border. It promised peace. It was a business merger, celebrated with bells and banners. But when Constanza arrived in Portugal for the wedding, she did not come alone. She brought with her a retinue of ladies in waiting, and among them was a woman named Inés de Castro. I want you to picture Inés. The chroniclers of the time called her Cuello de Heron's neck. She was described as having a beauty that was almost painful to look at. She was elegant, graceful, with skin as pale as milk, and eyes that seemed to hold a dangerous depth. She was a Galician noblewoman, illegitimate but highborn, with a charm that could disarm a guard at 50 paces. The moment Pedro saw Inés, the world stopped. It is a cliché in stories, love at first sight. We roll our eyes at it. But in the claustrophobic high-stakes world of a medieval court, where emotions are repressed and marriages are loveless, this kind of instant, lightning-strike attraction was real. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Pedro dutifully married Constanza. He said the vows, he wore the crown, but his eyes were always wandering to the back of the room, to where Inés stood in the shadows. And Insi she looked back. They began an affair. But this wasn't just a sordid fling in the linen closet. This was a soul-consuming passion. They wrote letters to each other daily. They met in secret in the gardens of the palace, whispering under the rustle of the olive trees. They were reckless with their love. The entire court could see the electricity crackling between them. Poor Constanza. She knew. How could she not know? She tried to stop it. She made Inés the godmother to her own son, hoping that the spiritual bond would make a physical relationship incestuous and forbidden in the eyes of the church. It was a clever move, a desperate move. But love, when it is this intense, does not care about canon law. It barely cares about gravity. Pedro and Inés continued. Then, in 1345, fate intervened. Constanza died, likely from complications of childbirth. Pedro was devastated not for his wife, but for the time he had wasted. He was finally free. He was a widower. He was the heir to the throne. He could do whatever he wanted, and what he wanted was Ins. He brought her out of the shadows. He moved her into the palace. He lived with her openly. They had children together, 3 sons and a daughter. For 10 years, they lived in a bubble of domestic bliss. Pedro refused to marry anyone else. The other kings of Europe sent portraits of their daughters, offering vast dowries and armies, but Pedro sent them all back. "I am taken," he effectively said. To Pedro, this was paradise. To his father, King Afonso IV, this was a political nightmare. We must understand the king's perspective. He wasn't just a grumpy old man who hated romance. He was terrified for his kingdom. Ins was Castilian. Her brothers were powerful, ambitious men who were constantly meddling in the politics of the region. King Afonso feared that Ins's family would whisper in Pedro's ear. He feared that once Pedro became king, Portugal would become a puppet of Castile. He feared that Ins's sons would challenge the legitimate heir Constanza's son for the throne, plunging the country into a civil war. The king's advisors, 3 men named Porro Coelho, Álvaro Goncalves, and Diogo Lopes Pacheco, fed these fears. They were the voices of reason. They whispered to the king, "She is a danger. She is a witch who has ensnared the prince. As long as she breathes, the kingdom is not safe." The tension in the palace was suffocating. It was a cold war between father and son. Pedro was stubborn. He declared that Ins was his true wife, claiming they had married in secret, a claim that is still debated by historians. He made it clear, "Where she goes, I go." King Afonso waited. He waited for the passion to cool. Surely, he thought, this is just lust. Surely he will get bored. But 10 years passed, and Pedro was more in love than ever. The king realized that he had run out of time. He was old. He would die soon. And when he died, Ins would effectively be queen. The influence of Castile would be absolute. He had to act. He had to make a choice between his son's happiness and the security of the state. He chose the state. The year is 1355. It is January. The winter in Portugal is mild, but the days are short and the shadows are long. Pedro was away. He had gone hunting. It was a trap, or perhaps just a stroke of terrible luck. He was miles away from the palace in Coimbra, chasing stag or boar, breathing the fresh air, thinking perhaps of returning to Ins that evening. While he was gone, King Afonso rode out. He didn't ride alone. He took his 3 advisors, Coelho, Goncalves, and Pacheco, the men who had been poisoning his mind against Ins for years. They rode to the monastery of Santa Clara Velha in Coimbra, where Ins was staying with her children. I want you to visualize the scene. Ins is in the courtyard, or perhaps the chapel. She hears the horses. She looks up and sees the royal standard. She sees the king, her father-in-law, a man she knows hates her. She knows, instantly, why he is there. Ins did not run. She couldn't outrun horses, and she had her children with her. Instead, she gathered her little ones, Pedro's children, the king's own grandchildren, around her like a shield. When the king entered the room, Ins threw herself at his feet. This is the moment that has been painted by artists and written about by poets for 700 years. It is the moment of ultimate vulnerability. She held up her children. She begged. She pleaded. "Do not kill me," she cried. "If not for me, then for them. Look at them. They are your blood. If you kill me, you orphan them. Have mercy, my lord. Send me away. Exile me to a convent. I will disappear. I will never see Pedro again. Just let me live." King Afonso looked down. He looked at the beautiful woman weeping on the stone floor. He looked at the terrified faces of his grandchildren clinging to her skirts. And for a moment, the king wavered. History tells us that Afonso turned away. His humanity broke through the political armor. He couldn't do it. He couldn't butcher a mother in front of her children. He signaled to his men that they should leave. The human tone of our story almost prevailed here. It was a moment where compassion nearly won. But as the king turned to leave, his advisors stopped him. Porro, Coelho, and Álvaro Goncalves blocked his path. They were the hard men. They were the ones who saw only the spreadsheet of power. "My lord," they whispered, urgent and hissed. "If you leave her alive, she will only grow stronger. Pedro will never forgive you for this threat. The kingdom will fall. You have come this far. You cannot turn back. The deed must be done." They argued that mercy now was cruelty, latter cruelty to the nation. They convinced the king that Ins was a cancer that had to be cut out. The king, week old, and pressured, finally nodded. He washed his hands of it. "Do what you must," he reportedly said, and walked out of the room. He left Inns alone with the butchers. The three men Coelho Goncalves and Pacheco drew their daggers. "We will not dwell on the gore, but we must acknowledge the horror. They didn't make it quick. They didn't show her the mercy of a clean execution. They attacked her. In front of her screaming children, they stabbed her repeatedly. The legend says her blood splattered onto the stones of the fountain in the garden. To this day, there is a fountain in the Quinta das Lagrimas, the estate of tears in Coimbra, where the stones have reddish moss, said to be stained by her blood. They say the fountain was created from her tears. Insta Castro died on that stone floor, her hand likely reaching out for a phantom Pedro who was miles away, laughing on a hunt, unaware that his heart was being carved out of his chest. The assassins wiped their blades. They looked at the body of the woman who had dared to love a prince. They felt justified. They felt they had saved Portugal. They mounted their horses and rode back to the capital, thinking the problem was solved. They thought that Pedro would be angry for a while, perhaps shout a bit, and then eventually marry a nice princess and move on. They thought grief was a temporary condition. They were wrong. When Pedro returned from the hunt, he rode to the monastery. He found the silence. He found the blood. He found his children, traumatized and weeping over the cooling body of their mother. The sound that Pedro made in that moment was probably not human. It was the sound of a wolf caught in a trap. It was the sound of a soul fracturing. He didn't just cry, he raged. The grief transmuted instantly into a fury so white-hot it terrified everyone around him. He declared war, not a metaphorical war, a literal one. He rallied his supporters. He launched a rebellion against his own father. For months, Portugal was torn apart by a civil war between the king and the prince. Pedro laid waste to the northern provinces. He burned. He looted. He was a man possessed. He wanted to burn the entire kingdom down to create a funeral pyre for Inns. Eventually, the Queen Pedro's mother intervened. A truce was brokered. Pedro was forced to lay down his arms. He was forced to swear an oath of forgiveness. He had to stand before his father and say the words, "I forgive you." He had to promise that he would not seek revenge against the three assassins. Pedro said the words. He signed the paper. He lowered his sword. But remember the lesson from our first story with Olga. Never mistake silence for submission. Pedro was playing the long game now. He knew he couldn't touch the assassins while his father was alive. The king protected them. So, Pedro waited. He went back to court. He smiled. He ate dinner with the men who had murdered the love of his life. He watched them breathe. He watched them grow comfortable. He waited for the one thing that comes to all men, even kings: death. 2 years later, in 1357, King Afonso IV died. The moment, the exact moment, the old king took his last breath, the truce was over. Pedro was no longer the prince. He was King Pedro I of Portugal. And the first order he gave as king was not about taxes, or roads, or laws. It was a hunting order. "Find them," he said. The three assassins, Coelho, Goncalves, and Pacheco, knew this was coming. They had fled to Castile the moment the old king fell ill. They knew the demon was off the leash. Pedro negotiated with the king of Castile. He arranged a prisoner exchange. He traded noble prisoners he held for the assassins. It was a cold, calculated trade. He managed to catch 2 of them, Pedro Coelho and Álvaro Gonçalves. The third, Pacheco, managed to escape by dressing as a beggar and fleeing to France, a lucky man, indeed. But for the 2 he caught, Pedro had a special plan. He didn't want to just execute them. He wanted to make a statement about the nature of humanity. He wanted to show them what they had taken from him. He had them brought to his palace in Santarém. He sat on his throne. He had a banquet prepared, and he ordered the 2 men to be dragged before him. The court watched in horror. They knew Pedro was angry, but they didn't know he had become something else entirely. Pedro looked at the men who had ignored Ince's pleas. He looked at the men who had stabbed a mother in front of her children. "You took my heart," Pedro reportedly said, "so I will take yours." And he meant it literally. But the details of that execution, the ripping, the eating, and the coronation of the corpse, that is a story for the next segment. For now, let us leave Pedro sitting on his throne, the 2 terrified assassins bound before him, the ghost of Inns standing by his side. The air is thick with anticipation. The candles are flickering. The king who ate hearts is about to earn his name. The love story is over. The horror story is about to begin. We are now in the throne room at Sebadum. The doors are barred. The courtiers are holding their breath. The king who ate hearts is about to perform one of the most visceral acts of vengeance in European history. This is not a battle, it is an autopsy of the human soul. No marker, they were turned to ash and scattered to the winds. Pedro returned to his throne. He washed his hands. He looked at his court. Imagine being a noble in that room. You have just watched your king, covered in gore, rip the hearts out of his advisors. What do? You bow. You bow lower than you have ever bowed before. You realize that the rules have changed. You realize that this is a king who acknowledges no limit to his power or his pain. From that day on, Pedro was known by two names. They saw a madman. They saw a tyrant who had tasted blood and might like it too much. Pedro ruled for 10 years. He seemed to be trying to build a world where no one would ever be hurt the way Inns was hurt. But he never remarried. He never looked at another woman. His heart was a closed room, occupied only by a ghost. And this brings us to the final and most famous part of his revenge. He refused to accept the reality of her death. He began to have dreams, or perhaps they were hallucinations. He declared that they had been married in secret before she died. She is the Queen of Portugal, Pedro announced, and she will have her coronation. The court was confused. But, Your Grace, she is dead. She has been in the ground for 2 years. Pedro looked at them with those dark, tunnel eyes. Then dig her up. He ordered the exhumation of Inns de Castro. He sent men to the monastery in Coimbra. They went to her grave. They took shovels. They dug through the earth until they hit the wood of the coffin. They pried off the lid. I want you to think about the reality of biology here. 2 years. The body does not stay pristine. It decays. It withers. What they found in that coffin was not the beautiful heroness neck with the milky skin. It was a skeleton, perhaps with some leathery skin clinging to the bone, wrapped in rotting burial clothes. It was a grim, ghastly thing. But Pedro didn't see a corpse. He saw his wife. He ordered the body to be brought to the cathedral. He ordered the finest seamstresses in the land to make a royal gown, purple velvet, gold thread, pearls. He ordered them to dress the corpse. Can you imagine the task of those seamstresses, dressing a skeleton in a ball gown? The fear, the smell. They placed the dressed cadaver on a throne beside Pedro's own. They put a crown on her skull. They arranged the skeletal hand on the armrest. And then, Pedro summoned the court. Behold your queen, Pedro said. The doors opened, the music played, and the coronation of the dead began. But the details of that ceremony, the line of nobles, the kissing of the hand, and the final journey to the tomb, that is the climax of our next segment. For now, let us stay in the throne room in Septarem. The banquet tables are cleared. The smell of blood has been scrubbed away with vinegar and rosewater, but the shadow remains. Pedro sits there, staring at the empty space beside him, planning the greatest piece of macabre theater the world has ever seen. The night is deep, and the ghosts are gathering. The year is still 1357, or perhaps early 1358. The timeline is blurred by the fog of legend, but the image is crystal clear. We are in the ancient city of Coimbra. The great stone church is filled with the nobility of Portugal. Everyone who is anyone is here. Dukes, counts, bishops, knights. They are dressed in their finest silks, their heaviest velvets, their most glittering jewels. But there is no joy in their faces. There is only a suffocating dread. They are standing in rows, whispering, glancing nervously at the altar. The air is thick with the smoke of frankincense and myrrh, heavy, resinous scents used by the church for centuries. But tonight, the incense is burning thicker than usual. It is being used to mask a smell. The smell of something that has been in the earth for 2 years. At the front of the cathedral, on a raised dais, sit 2 thrones. On the first throne sits King Pedro I. He is wearing his crown, holding his scepter. He sits like a statue, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. On the second throne, citizens, I want you to visualize this with compassion, not just horror. They have dressed her in the robes of a queen. A mantle of royal purple, embroidered with gold thread, drapes over her shoulders. A veil of fine lace covers her face, obscuring the worst ravages of decay. But the veil cannot hide the shape. The hands that rest on the velvet armrests are not hands of flesh and blood. They are skeletal claws, the skin dried and brown like old parchment. On her head, resting on the remaining wisps of her hair, is a crown of gold and precious stones. Come forward and pay homage to your queen. This was Pedro's masterstroke. He wasn't just honoring Inns, he was forcing the entire kingdom to participate in his madness. He was forcing them to bow to the woman they had killed. The line begins to move. Imagine being the first noble in that line. You walk up the steps of the dais. Your heart is pounding in your throat. You approach the throne. You look at the king, but he does not look at you. He is watching your reaction. You turn to the corpse. You bow low. You kneel on the hard stone. And then, you have to do the unthinkable. Protocol demands that you kiss the hand of the monarch. The noble reaches out. He takes that cold, skeletal hand in his own. He feels the rough texture of the bone. He smells the faint, sweet-sick odor of death that the incense cannot fully hide. And he presses his warm, living lips against the dead hand of Insta Castro. He swears allegiance. I swear fealty to Queen Inns, he whispers, his voice trembling. Then he rises, backs away, and the next man steps forward. This went on for hours. One by one, the entire court of Portugal was forced to kiss the corpse. Fine, now you will treat her like a god when she is dead. It is a scene that borders on the insane, yes, but it is also deeply, tragically romantic. It is the act of a man who refuses to let death have the final word. He is shouting at the universe, she matters, she is still here. He had one final journey to make. He ordered a funeral procession unlike anything the world had ever seen. Thousands of torches, a river of fire stretching across the countryside. The chroniclers tell us that the night was turned into day. The procession moved slowly along this road of light. The hearse was magnificent, pulled by horses draped in black velvet. They carried Inns inside, to the transept of the great church, and there, Pedro had prepared 2 tombs. These tombs are real. Pedro's design for the tombs reveals the final, beautiful secret of his revenge. Usually, kings and queens are buried side by side, lying on their backs, looking up at heaven. Why? Because Pedro was a religious man. He believed in the resurrection. He believed that on Judgment Day, the trumpets would sound, the graves would open, and the dead would rise. He wanted the tombs placed foot to foot, so that the very first thing he would see when he sat up on the last day would be her. He didn't want to see the ceiling. He didn't want to see an angel. He wanted to see Inns. He wanted his eyes to meet hers instantly, across the barrier of death, reuniting them before they even ascended to heaven. On the tombs, he had an inscription carved, a simple motto that summed up his entire life, his entire war, his entire grief. Até o fim do mundo, until the end of the world. Pedro lived for another 10 years after the coronation. He ruled justly. He never remarried. He died in 1367, and he was laid to rest in the tomb opposite Inns, and there they lie, to this day. In the silence of the monastery, the king and his queen wait. They wait for the end of the world. They wait to wake up and see each other again. The story of Pedro and Inns is a revenge story. Yes, it has blood and torture and eaten hearts. But at its core, it is a story about the refusal to let go. It is a story about a love so ferocious that it burned down a kingdom and defied the grave itself. So, as you lie in the dark, think about that inscription, until the end of the world. It's a heavy thought, a comforting thought, but we must move on. The candles in the monastery are flickering out. The white marble is cold. We have explored the frozen rivers of Russia, the stormy seas of France, and the sun-drenched sorrow of Portugal. Now, we must travel east, far east. We are going to the vast, endless steppes of Central Asia, the land of the blue sky, the land of the horse. We are going to meet a man who needs no introduction, but whose capacity for revenge makes Pedro look like a gentle amateur. We are going to meet Genghis Khan. Most people know him as a conqueror, but his greatest conquest began not with a desire for land, but with a desire for respect. It began with a trade deal gone wrong. It began with a single act of arrogance by a governor who didn't know who he was dealing with. And it ends with a river of molten silver. The world is about to get much, much bigger. And the revenge is about to get much, much louder. Pull up the covers. The horde is coming. Here is the expanded script for segment 11. We leave the stone cathedrals of Europe behind. We leave the enclosed, suffocating spaces of crypts and castles. We are going to a place where the horizon has no end. We are going to the steppe. The air here is thin and sharp. The sky is a terrifyingly vast dome of blue. This is the stage for the single greatest act of destruction in the history of revenge. He ran back into the desert. He survived the journey back to Mongolia. He collapsed at the feet of Genghis Khan and told him what had happened. Now, pause and visualize Genghis Khan receiving this news. He is in his tent. The fire is burning in the center. He is drinking fermented mare's milk. He listens to the survivor. He hears about the theft. He hears about the murder of his subjects. The popular image of Genghis is that he would instantly jump on his horse and scream for war. But he didn't. This is what makes the story so chilling. Genghis Khan was a man of extreme discipline. He knew that war with the Khwarezmians was a massive undertaking. They had a huge army, better walls, and home field advantage. He didn't want a war. He still wanted trade. He decided to give them a second chance. He thought, perhaps this was a mistake. Perhaps the governor went rogue. Surely the Sultan, a king like myself, would not sanction the murder of ambassadors. So, Genghis Khan did something incredible. He sent a second delegation. This time, he didn't send merchants. He sent diplomats. He chose 3 men. One was a Muslim, to speak to the Sultan as a brother in faith. The other 2 were Mongols. He gave them a message for Sultan Muhammad. It was a message of stern but fair warning. You have killed my merchants and seized my goods. The message said, hand over the governor Inulhuk to me, so that I may punish him for his crime. If you do this, we can still have peace. If you do not, I cannot answer for what will happen. The 3 ambassadors rode west. They rode into the lion's mouth. They arrived at the Sultan's court, likely in the city of Samarkand. They stood before the most powerful man in the Islamic world. They delivered the Khan's message. This was the turning point. The Sultan had a choice. He could sacrifice his uncle the thief and a murderer and save his empire. He could apologize. He could pay reparations. It would have been humiliating, yes, but it would have been rational. But Sultan Muhammad was not rational. He was drunk on his own power. He looked at these 3 envoys standing in his magnificent tiled palace. He felt insulted. How dare this barbarian dictate terms to me? How dare he demand my uncle? The Sultan looked at the envoys. He looked at his guards. And he made the decision that would doom millions of people. He ordered the head of the lead ambassador, the Muslim, to be cut off. Right there, in the throne room. But for the 2 Mongol ambassadors, he reserved a special shame. He didn't kill them. He ordered his guards to burn off their beards. In Mongol culture, the beard was a symbol of manhood and dignity. To shave a man's beard was to castrate him socially. It was a fate worse than death. The Sultan sent the 2 shamed, beardless Mongols back to Genghis Khan carrying the severed head of their colleague in a bag. Tell your master, the Sultan effectively said, that this is my answer. Imagine the journey of those 2 survivors. riding back across the steppe, feeling the wind on their scarred faces, carrying the rotting head of their friend. They knew what they were carrying. They weren't just carrying a head, they were carrying the apocalypse. He saw the beardless faces, he saw the head. The history books tell us exactly what he did. A terrifying, heavy silence that spread through the entire camp. He walked alone up the side of a sacred mountain called Burkhan Khaldun. He took off his hat, he loosened his belt and draped it over his neck, a sign of absolute submission to the heavens. He knelt on the mountaintop, he pressed his face into the dirt, and he prayed to Tengri, the eternal blue sky. He prayed for 3 days and 3 nights. He didn't eat, he didn't sleep. He simply asked the sky god for permission to punish the men who had broken the sacred laws of hospitality. In the nomadic world, harming an ambassador is the ultimate sin. It breaks the trust that allows human beings to interact. On the 4th day, Genghis Khan came down from the mountain. He looked different. His eyes were hard. He walked to his generals. He spoke a sentence that has echoed through history like a thunderclap. "I have prepared a place for you," he said. "We are going to the west." And then, he said the words that would become his terrifying epitaph. "I am the flail of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." He mobilized the nation. This wasn't a raiding party. This was a migration of death. He called up every able-bodied man. He brought the engineers from China who knew how to build siege engines. He brought the doctors. He brought the astronomers. He assembled an army of over 100,000 horsemen, a sea of cavalry. The target was not just Inalhuk. It was not just the Sultan. It was the entire Khwarezmian civilization. The Khan was coming, and he was bringing hell with him. But the specific fate of the greedy governor Inalhuk, the man who started it all for a few bolts of silk, that is a story of poetic justice, so grim it belongs in a horror movie. And the destruction of the empire itself. The diversion of rivers, the mountains of skulls. That is the story for the next segment. For now, visualize the dust cloud rising in the east. A dust cloud that stretches from the earth to the sky. It is moving west. It is moving toward in the city. Governor Inalhuk is probably counting his silver. He is probably feeling very smart. He has no idea that the ground is already trembling beneath his feet. Here is the expanded script for segment 12. We are now standing on the high mud brick walls of the city of Otra. The desert wind is blowing. The sun is setting. And on the eastern horizon, a darkness is spreading that has nothing to do with the night. He wasn't dead yet. He knew there was no escape for him. He knew he couldn't surrender. So, he retreated to the citadel, the fortified castle within the city. He took his last few loyal guards and locked the doors. The Mongols surrounded the citadel. They battered down the gates. They swarmed up the stairs. The final stand of Inalhuk is a scene of desperate, pathetic heroism. He fought like a cornered rat. He fought on the roof of his palace. The chronicles tell us a fascinating detail. When his quiver ran dry, when he had fired his last arrow, he didn't give up. He started ripping the tiles off the roof of his own palace. He threw bricks and decorative pottery down at the Mongol soldiers climbing the walls. Think about the irony. The palace he had enriched with stolen wealth was now being dismantled by his own hands to be used as ammunition. He was throwing his own house at his executioners. But you cannot stop a tide with roof tiles. The Mongols reached the roof. They overwhelmed him. But Tand, this is crucial, Genghis Khan had given a specific order. Do not kill him. He wanted him alive. Death in battle was too good for Inalhuk. It was too honorable. The Khan wanted to have a conversation. They dragged the governor down from the roof. They dragged him through the burning ruins of his city. They dragged him past the bodies of his citizens. They brought him to the tent of Genghis Khan, pitched outside the city walls. It was the meeting that had been 5 months in the making. The merchant of death meeting the thief, Inalhuk, was thrown to the ground. He was bruised, bloody, covered in dust. He looked up at the Khan. We don't know what words were exchanged. Perhaps Genghis didn't say anything at all. Perhaps he just looked at him with those cold, predator eyes. But we know the sentence. Genghis Khan knew why Inalhuk had done it. He knew it wasn't about politics or religion. It was about greed. It was about the silver. Inalhuk had loved precious metals so much that he was willing to kill 450 innocent men for it. You have such a hunger for silver, the Khan might have said. You love it so much. It seems cruel to deny you your heart's desire. Genghis turned to his smiths. He gave an order. They brought out a crucible. They started a fire. They took silver coins, perhaps the very same silver coins Inalhuk had stolen from the caravan, and threw them into the pot. Inalhuk was forced to watch. He was held down by strong guards. He watched the fire roar. He watched the silver coins lose their shape. He watched them turn from solid currency into a shimmering, liquid mirror. The desert wind blows across the plains of Central Asia. It picks up the dust, swirls it into little tornadoes, and carries it across the miles. Today, if you travel to the regions that were once the heart of the Khwarezmian Empire, parts of modern-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Iran, you will find vast stretches of silence. You will find mounds of earth that look like natural hills, but are actually the melted remains of mud brick walls. You will find broken shards of blue pottery, half buried in the sand. These are the tombstones of an empire. After the execution of Inalhuk, Genghis Khan did not pack up and go home. He had come for justice, yes, but he stayed for extermination. He realized that as long as the Sultan, Muhammad II, was alive, and as long as the cities of Khwarezmia stood, they would be a threat. They would regroup. They would seek revenge of their own. So, he issued a command that changed the demographics of the world. Grass, he is reported to have said, should grow where their cities stand. The war shifted gears. It became a manhunt. Genghis Khan called for his two most terrifying generals, Gib and Subutai. These men were the wolves of the steppe. They were tactical geniuses who could ride for days without sleep, who could coordinate armies across hundreds of miles without radios. The Khan gave them a simple mission. Do not stop for loot. Do not stop for cities. Find the Sultan. Chase him until he has nowhere left to run. Imagine the psychological horror for Sultan Muhammad. A few months ago, he was the self-proclaimed shadow of God on earth. He commanded 400,000 men. He lived in palaces of marble and gold. Now, he was a fugitive in his own kingdom. The Mongol generals picked up his scent. They tore across the land like arrows released from a bow. Every time the Sultan arrived in a city, hoping to rest, hoping to rally his troops, the news would come. They are coming. The dust cloud was on the horizon. The ground was trembling. The Sultan ran. He ran from Samarkand to Balkh. He ran through the mountain passes of Iran. He shed his royal robes. He disguised himself. He slept in barns, in caves, in the homes of terrified peasants who didn't recognize their own king. The man who had shaved the beards of the Mongol ambassadors was now afraid to show his own face. The chase went on for thousands of miles. It was relentless. The Mongols didn't care about supply lines. They drank the blood of their horses and ate dried curd. They were faster than news, faster than fear. Finally, the Sultan ran out of land. He reached the shores of the Caspian Sea. He looked out at the grey water and realized he was trapped. The Mongols were closing in. In a panic, he boarded a small boat and sailed to a tiny, desolate island off the coast, near the modern port of Astrar. There, on a lump of rock inhabited only by lepers and fishermen, the master of the setting sun met his end. He didn't die in battle. He didn't die by the sword. He died of pleurisy, lung infection brought on by exhaustion and exposure. He died in rags, shivering, alone. The chroniclers tell us that he was so poor at the end that he didn't even have a shroud to be buried in. His servants wrapped him in a dirty shirt and put him in a shallow grave. The man who had owned mountains of silver died with nothing. The Mongols never even touched him. They didn't have to. Fear killed him. But while the Sultan was dying on his rock, his empire was dying in the fire. Genghis Khan and his sons Joki, Chagatai and Gedi were systematically dismantling the great cities of the Islamic Golden Age. Bukhara, Samarkand, Balkh, Merv, Nishapur. The names of these cities sound exotic to us now, perhaps even distant. But in the 13th century, they were the New Yorks, the Londons, the Parises of the world. They were centers of learning, where astronomers mapped the stars and poets wrote verses that are still read today. They had libraries filled with centuries of knowledge. They had irrigation systems that turned the desert into a garden. The Mongols arrived at the city of Urgench. Urgench was the jewel in the crown. It was the capital. It was the Sultan's birthplace. It sat on the banks of the mighty Amu Darya River. It was a metropolis of high walls, busy bazaars, and hundreds of thousands of people. The siege of Urgench was the hardest fight of the entire war. The citizens knew what had happened to Otrar. They knew there was no mercy coming, so they fought for every inch. When the Mongols breached the walls, the battle didn't stop. It turned into urban warfare. The defenders fought in the streets. They fought in the houses. They burned their own neighborhoods to slow the Mongols down. The Mongols hated this kind of fighting. They were cavalrymen. They liked open fields. Fighting in narrow alleys cost them dearly. Thousands of Mongol soldiers died. And when the Mongols lose men, they get angry. When the city finally fell, the rage of the Khan's sons was bottomless. They didn't just want to kill the people. They wanted to punish the geography itself. They wanted to make sure that Urgench could never, ever rise again. They looked at the Amu Darya River. For centuries, this river had been the lifeblood of the city. It filled the moats, watered the fields, and provided transport. The engineers of Khwarezmia had built a great dam upstream to control the flow and direct it into the irrigation canals. The Mongols rode up to the dam. I want you to visualize the labor involved. They forced their prisoners, thousands of exhausted, starving captives, to work. They didn't repair the dam. They broke it, but they didn't just break it randomly. They dug new channels. They re-engineered the landscape. They diverted the entire flow of one of Central Asia's greatest rivers. They turned the river so that it flowed directly through the city of Urgench. It wasn't a flood that rose and fell. It was a relocation of the water. The river crashed into the ruins of the city. It swept away the mud brick houses. It dissolved the walls. It filled the basements. It turned the capital of the empire into a swamp. Where there had been libraries and mosques, there was now only mud and water. The city was literally washed off the map. The physical evidence of its existence was erased. The Mongols didn't just conquer Urgench, they drowned it. This was the ultimate revenge. You thought you were a great civilization. Now you are fish food. But the destruction went deeper than just one city. The Mongols understood that civilization in a desert relies on one thing: infrastructure. Specifically, the qanats. The qanats were ancient underground canals, feats of engineering that brought water from the mountains to the arid plains. They were delicate. They required constant maintenance by skilled laborers. The Mongols slaughtered the laborers. They smashed the canal entrances. They filled the wells with rocks and corpses. By destroying the water system, they ensured that no one could live there even after the army left. They turned fertile farmland back into desert. They desertified the region. It is said that the Mongol invasion was one of the few human events in history that actually cooled the global climate, because so many cultivated fields returned to forests or scrubland, scrubbing carbon from the atmosphere. The death toll is something that the human mind struggles to comprehend. The chroniclers of the time give numbers that seem impossible: millions dead in Merv, millions in Nishapur. Even if we account for exaggeration, the reality was a genocide of biblical proportions. In the city of Nishapur, the husband of Genghis Khan's daughter was killed by an arrow. When the city fell, Genghis's daughter asked for permission to decide the city's fate. She ordered that every living thing be killed. Not just the men, not just the women and children, the dogs, the cats, the livestock. She wanted nothing left alive. The Mongols built pyramids of skulls. This isn't a metaphor. They literally piled the severed heads of their victims into massive conical towers outside the city gates. One pyramid for men, one for women, one for children. They stood as gruesome monuments to the price of resistance. Why did they do this? Why such extreme cruelty? It was psychological warfare. The Mongols were a small population, perhaps only 1 million people total. They were conquering empires of tens of millions. They couldn't garrison every city. They couldn't leave soldiers behind to police the population. So, they used terror as a weapon. They needed the next city to surrender without a fight. They needed the reputation of the Devil's Horsemen to travel ahead of them. When the people of a city heard that the Mongols were coming, they didn't think of fighting. They thought of the pyramids of skulls. They opened their gates and prayed for mercy. Genghis Khan's revenge against the Khwarezmian Empire was total. In less than 3 years, he had wiped a major world power off the face of the earth. The Khwarezmian language, gone. Their art, smashed. Their royal lineage, ended in a pauper's grave on an island. They are remembered today largely because of their destruction. They are a footnote in the biography of the Khan. It brings us back to that first moment. The moment Inalhuk looked at the caravan and saw easy money. The moment the Sultan looked at the ambassadors and saw barbarians. They made the mistake of thinking that civilization protects you. They thought that because they had walls and books and laws, they were safe from the wild. Genghis Khan proved them wrong. He showed them that civilization is a fragile thing. It is a candle flame in a hurricane. All it takes is one gust of wind, one focused, disciplined, unstoppable force of nature, and the lights go out. As we stand in the mud of Urgench, listening to the rushing water of the diverted river, the silence of the aftermath is deafening. The cries of the victims have faded. The pyramids of skulls have long since turned to dust. But the lesson remains. Arrogance is a dangerous luxury. And revenge, when practiced by a master, is not just about getting even. It is about changing the world so that your enemy no longer has a place in it. The Khwarezmian Empire is gone, but our journey is not quite over. We have seen physical destruction on a massive scale. We have seen the earth scorched and the rivers moved. But there is one more kind of revenge we need to explore. It is a quieter revenge. It is a revenge that doesn't leave scars on the land, but leaves scars on the soul of history. It is the revenge of the intellectual. Genghis Khan used a sword. Our next subject used a pen. Genghis Khan made his enemies die. Our next subject made his enemies live forever, but in a way they would have hated. We are leaving the steppes. We are leaving the open sky. We are going to the narrow, winding streets of Florence, Italy. We are going to meet a man with a broken heart, a sharp nose, and a very, very long memory. Dante Alighieri is waiting for us, and he has a special place in hell reserved just for the people who wronged him. Pulled the blanket up. The air is cooling. We are descending into the inferno. Welcome to Florence. If you visit Florence today, you see a Disneyland of the Renaissance. You see the Duomo, the statues of David, the tourists eating gelato. It feels like a city of light and art. But in the late 13th century, Florence was a snake pit. It was a city at war with itself. There were no Mongol hordes outside the gates. The enemy was the neighbor across the street. The city was torn apart by a feud between two political factions, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And even when the Guelphs won, they couldn't stop fighting. So they split into two new factions, the Black Guelphs and the White Guelphs. It sounds ridiculous to us now, like fighting over the color of a jersey, but people died for these labels. They burned down houses for them. In the middle of this chaos lived a man named Dante Alighieri. We know him as the dour poet, with the laurel wreath and the hook nose. But in 1300, Dante was a man of action. He was a politician. He was a white Guelph. He was elected as one of the priors of Florence, basically one of the city's top magistrates. He loved his city with a fierce, possessive passion. He believed in the independence of Florence. He wanted to protect it from the meddling of the Pope in Rome, and that was his mistake. The Pope at the time was Boniface. The 8th Boniface was not a holy man in the turn-the-other-cheek sense. He was a power broker. He was ambitious, greedy, and ruthless. He wanted Tuscany under his thumb. In 1301, while Dante was away in Rome on a diplomatic mission, ironically, trying to negotiate peace with the Pope, the coup happened. The Black Guelphs, backed by the Pope's French mercenaries, stormed Florence. They seized the government. They rampaged through the streets, destroying the property of the White Guelphs. Dante, the loyal public servant, was suddenly enemy number one. The new government put him on trial in absentia. The charges were trumped up: corruption, embezzlement, acting against the church. It was a smear campaign. They ordered him to pay a massive fine and banned him from public office for life. Dante, being a man of principle and also broke, refused to pay. He refused to admit guilt for crimes he didn't commit. So, the Black Guelphs escalated. They passed a second sentence. If Dante Alighieri was ever found within the walls of Florence again, he would be burned at the stake. Imagine the shock. One day, you are a respected leader of your city. The next, you are a homeless fugitive with a price on your head. Dante couldn't go home. He couldn't see his wife, who was a Donati, a relative of the Black Guelphs, which made things awkward. He couldn't see his children. His property was confiscated. His house was likely looted. He became a wanderer. For the next 20 years, Dante walked the roads of Italy. He went from castle to castle, relying on the charity of strange patrons. He knew the humiliation of sleeping in other men's beds, of eating other men's bread. He famously wrote about how salty the bread of strangers tastes. It was a life of bitter, grinding loneliness. He watched from a distance as his enemies in Florence lived the life that should have been his. He watched them get rich. He watched them get fat. He watched the Pope Boniface VIII continue to manipulate the politics of Italy like a puppet master. Most men in Dante's position would have done one of two things. They would have raised an army to try and retake the city, which Dante tried, briefly, before realizing his fellow exiles were idiots. Or they would have withered away into obscurity, drinking themselves to death in a tavern in Verona. But Dante was not most men. He was a genius, and he was furious. He realized he couldn't beat them with a sword. He couldn't beat them with money. So, he decided to beat them with ink. He sat down to write. He began a poem. He called it simply Commedia. The divine part was added later by Boccaccio. On the surface, the Divine Comedy is a religious journey. It is the story of a man, Dante himself, trekking through the three realms of the afterlife: Inferno, Hell, Purgatorio, Purgatory, and Paradiso, Heaven. It is an allegory for the soul's journey toward God. It is beautiful, complex, and deeply spiritual. But look closer. Peel back the layers of theology, and what do you find? You find the greatest diss track in human history. Dante built a hell. He designed it with architectural precision. 9 circles, descending into the earth, getting colder and more terrible as you go down. And he needed people to populate it. He didn't just fill it with generic sinners. He filled it with people he knew. He filled it with his enemies. Imagine the power of that. In the 14th century, there was no Twitter, no cancel culture, no libel laws that could stop him. If you wrote a book and people read it, that became the truth. Dante realized that he had the power to act as God. He got to decide where people went when they died. He placed the black guelphs who exiled him in the nastiest parts of hell. He placed the politicians who took bribes in a pit of boiling tar. He described their suffering in high definition, 4K detail. He wrote about them screaming, tearing at their own flesh, being tormented by demons. But his biggest target, the man he hated most, Pope Boniface VIII. Now, there was a technical problem. When Dante was writing the Inferno, Pope Boniface was still alive, or had only recently died, depending on the timeline of the drafting. You can't put a living man in hell. But Dante didn't let a little thing like being alive stop him. In Canto 19, Dante visits the 8th circle of hell, reserved for the simoniacs, those who sold church offices and pardons for money. The punishment for these sinners is bizarre and humiliating. They are buried upside down in holes in the rock, with their feet sticking out. The soles of their feet are on fire. Dante walks up to one of these holes. He sees a pair of twitching, burning legs. He asks, "Who is in there?" The voice from the hole answers, "It is Pope Nicholas III." But Pope Nicholas makes a mistake. He hears Dante's voice and thinks it is someone else. "Is that you, Boniface?" the tortured Pope asks. "Are you here already?" It is a stroke of genius. Dante manages to put Boniface in hell before he is even dead. He is a dead Pope confirm that a spot is being saved for Boniface. He is telling the world, the current Pope is so corrupt, so evil, that hell is literally keeping a warm seat for him. It was a devastating insult. It stripped the Pope of his holiness. It reduced him to a pair of burning feet sticking out of a rock. Dante didn't stop there. He populated hell with his personal rivals, his political enemies, and even people who had just annoyed him in Florence. It's that he wrote the narrative. He realized that history is not written by the victors. It is written by the writers. The Black Guelphs won the political battle. They got the power. They got the money. But Dante won the war of eternity. He turned their victory into a footnote in his poem. As we close the book on Dante, we see a different kind of epic revenge. It is not bloody. It is not fast. It is a slow, cold, intellectual dismantling of the opposition. It is the revenge of the artist. He proved that if you hurt a writer, they won't just kill you, they will make you immortal, and they will make you ugly. And now, we have reached the end of our journey through the medieval book of grudges. We have seen fire, ice, water, silver, and ink. We have seen that the human need for justice is a force as powerful as gravity. But we have one final segment, a conclusion, a way to tie all these threads together and say goodnight. Let's turn the page one last time. Here is an expansion of segment 15, titled The Viper in the Vault. In the context of a medieval revenge saga, this segment serves as the belly of the whale, Winter, point where the protagonist, having breached the enemy's outer defenses, must navigate the most dangerous inner sanctum to locate their target, only to find the situation far more complex than anticipated. Segment 15. The Viper in the Vault. The silence in the lower corridors of Blackstone Keep was not empty. It was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Edric pressed his back against the rough-hewn stone, his breath shallow and controlled. Above him, 3 floors up, the celebratory feast for the winter solstice was raging. He could hear the dull, rhythmic thumping of boots on timber, the muffled roar of drunken laughter, and the occasional shrill cry of a trumpet. They were celebrating the anniversary of the unification built on the ashes of Edric's kin. But down here, in the bowels of the keep, the world was cold and smelled of damp earth and old iron. Edric checked his weapons. The dagger at his hip, forged from a plowshare salvaged from his burnt farm, felt hot against his thigh. His primary blade, a stolen arming sword with a chipped pommel, was loosened in its scabbard. He looked at Kalen, his sole companion in this madness. The massive Northman was wiping a smudge of soot from his forehead, his eyes gleaming with a mix of anticipation and grim resolve. 2 guards at the intersection, Kalen whispered, his voice like grinding gravel. Standard patrol. They turn every 4 minutes. Too slow, Edric replied. Voldemar won't stay at the feast forever. Once he retires to his chambers, the elite guard will double. We need to be inside the vault before the wine wears off. Then we take them. Edric nodded. This was segment 15 of their long, bloody equation, the variable where stealth had to be traded for violence. They moved like smoke. The corridor was lit by sputtering torches set in iron sconces every 20 paces, casting long, dancing shadows that offered brief sanctuaries of darkness. Edric took the left, Kalen the right. They reached the corner just as the heavy footsteps of the patrol grew louder. Clank, clank, clank. The first guard rounded the corner, a boredom-glazed look on his face, his helmet unbuckled for comfort. He never saw Edric. Edric stepped from the shadow, his hand clamping over the guard's mouth, driving the pommel of his sword into the man's temple with a sickening crunch. The guard folded instantly. Simultaneously, Kalen surged forward. The second guard, sharper than the first, managed a half-gasp before Kelon's massive forearm crushed his windpipe against the stone wall. There was a brief struggle to scrape of boots on stone, the rattle of chainmail before Kalen twisted his hips and snapped the man's neck. Silence returned, heavier than before. The keys, Edric hissed. Kalen rummaged through the second guard's belt, retrieving a heavy iron ring. Got them. But this is too easy, Edric. Voldemar is paranoid. He sees assassins in his soup. Why is the vault lightly guarded? Because he thinks the vault is impenetrable, Edric said, though a seed of doubt began to germinate in his gut. Or because the trap is already sprung. They dragged the bodies into a dark alcove used for storing wine casks and covered them with burlap sacks. Edric led the way deeper, down a spiral staircase that narrowed until their shoulders brushed the walls. The air grew colder, the smell of damp replaced by the sterile scent of dry stone and parchment. They stood before the vault of ciphers. It was a massive door of oak and iron bands, inscribed with the crest of the usurper, a hawk gripping a serpent. Edric stared at the serpent. That was us, he thought, the snake that was meant to be crushed. Do it, Edric commanded. Kalen fumbled with the keys, trying 3 before the 4th slid into the mechanism with a satisfying click. He turned it. The tumblers groaned, ancient and unoiled, echoing loudly in the narrow stairwell. Edric winced at the noise. With a heave, Kalen pushed the door open. The room beyond was not filled with gold. Voldemar did not hoard coin. He hoarded secrets. Rows of shelves lined the walls, stacked high with scrolls, leather-bound ledgers, and map tubes. In the center of the room stood a solitary desk, illuminated by a single magical Gloucester rare luxury imported from the east. And sitting at the desk, facing the door, was not Valdemar. It was a woman. She didn't flinch as the door swung open. She was dressed in the severe grey robes of a scribe, her hair pulled back in a tight braid. A quill hovered over a piece of parchment. She looked up, her eyes calm, terrified, and resigned all at once. "You're late," she said softly. Edric stepped into the room, sword drawn. "Who are you?" "I am Alara, the archivist." She placed the quill down slowly. "Lord Valdemar told me that if I finished the transcription before midnight, I might live. If I didn't, he would skin me. But he also said that if the Ghost of the North arrived, I was to give him a message." Edric approached the desk, the tip of his sword hovering inches from her throat. "Where is he?" "He is not at the feast," Alara said, her voice trembling slightly now. "The man at the high table wearing the hawk crest is a double. A body double paid in gold and promised lands he will never live to see." Kalon cursed from the doorway. "I told you, it was too easy." "Where is Voldemar?" Edric roared, slamming his free hand onto the desk. Ink spilled across the parchment. "He is gone," Ilara whispered. "He left an hour ago through the postern gate. He rides for the coastal fortress. He knows you are coming. He has known for weeks." Edric felt the floor tilt beneath him. Weeks. He had been so careful. Every kill had been silent, every movement shrouded. "He left this for you," Alara said. sliding a small, black velvet box across the desk. Edric stared at it. It looked like a coffin for a rat. With the tip of his sword, he flipped the lid open. Inside rested a severed finger. On the finger was a ring silver, set with a rough-cut sapphire. Edric's breath hitched. The rage that usually burned hot and bright in his chest suddenly turned into a block of ice. He knew that ring. It belonged to his brother Torian. Torian, whom he had hidden away in the sanctuary of the monastics, in the High Valley. Torian, who was supposed to be safe. He raided the monastery 3 days ago, Alara said, tears finally spilling from her eyes. He wanted you to know that there is no sanctuary, he said. He said the game ends where it began. Edric picked up the ring. It was cold. He didn't scream. He didn't smash the room. He simply slid the ring onto his own pinky finger, where it sat loose and heavy. Kalen, Edric said, his voice void of all humanity. I burn it, the ledger, all of it. Burn the room. Burn the history he thinks gives him power. And the girl, Kalen asked, looking at Ilara. Edric looked at the scribe. She was shivering. Run, he told her. Run as far as you can, and never write another word for a tyrant. Alara didn't need to be told twice. She bolted past Kalen and up the stairs. Kalen grabbed a torch from the wall and tossed it onto the pile of scrolls in the corner. The dry parchment caught instantly, curling and blackening as the flames licked upward. We need to move, Edric, Kalen urged. If he knew we were coming, the trap isn't the vault. The trap is the exit. As if on cue, a deep, resonant thud echoed from the hallway. Then another, the sound of heavy shields locking together. Testudo, Kalon growled, drawing his tax house guard. Edric turned away from the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. He didn't feel fear. He felt a terrible clarity. Voldemar had made a mistake. By taking Torian, he had removed Edric's only tether to caution. It's that he wrote the narrative. He realized that history is not written by the victors. It is written by the writers. The Black Guelphs won the political battle. They got the power. They got the money. But Dante won the War of Eternity. He turned their victory into a footnote in his poem. As we close the book on Dante, we see a different kind of epic revenge. It is not bloody. It is not fast. It is a slow, cold, intellectual dismantling of the opposition. It is the revenge of the artist. He proved that if you hurt a writer, they won't just kill you. They will make you immortal, and they will make you ugly. And now, we have reached the end of our journey through the medieval book of grudges. We have seen fire, ice, water, silver, and ink. We have seen that the human need for justice is a force as powerful as gravity. But we have one final segment, a conclusion, a way to tie all these threads together and say goodnight. Let's turn the page one last time. Here is an expansion of segment 15, titled The Viper in the Vault. In the context of a medieval revenge saga, this segment serves as the belly of the whale, Winter, point where the protagonist, having breached the enemy's outer defenses, must navigate the most dangerous inner sanctum to locate their target, only to find the situation far more complex than anticipated. Segment 15. The Viper in the Vault. The silence in the lower corridors of Blackstone Keep was not empty. It was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Edric pressed his back against the rough-hewn stone, his breath shallow and controlled. Above him, 3 floors up, the celebratory feast for the winter solstice was raging. He could hear the dull, rhythmic thumping of boots on timber, the muffled roar of drunken laughter, and the occasional shrill cry of a trumpet. They were celebrating the anniversary of the unification built on the ashes of Edric's kin. But down here, in the bowels of the keep, the world was cold and smelled of damp earth and old iron. Edric checked his weapons. The dagger at his hip, forged from a plowshare salvaged from his burnt farm, felt hot against his thigh. His primary blade, a stolen arming sword with a chipped pommel, was loosened in its scabbard. He looked at Kalen, his sole companion in this madness. The massive Northman was wiping a smudge of soot from his forehead, his eyes gleaming with a mix of anticipation and grim resolve. 2 guards at the intersection, Kalen whispered, his voice like grinding gravel. Standard patrol. They turn every 4 minutes. Too slow, Edric replied. Voldemar won't stay at the feast forever. Once he retires to his chambers, the elite guard will double. We need to be inside the vault before the wine wears off. Then we take them. Edric nodded. This was segment 15 of their long, bloody equation, the variable where stealth had to be traded for violence. They moved like smoke. The corridor was lit by sputtering torches set in iron sconces every 20 paces, casting long, dancing shadows that offered brief sanctuaries of darkness. Edric took the left, Kalen the right. They reached the corner just as the heavy footsteps of the patrol grew louder. Clank, clank, clank. The first guard rounded the corner, a boredom-glazed look on his face, his helmet unbuckled for comfort. He never saw Edric. Edric stepped from the shadow, his hand clamping over the guard's mouth, driving the pommel of his sword into the man's temple with a sickening crunch. The guard folded instantly. Simultaneously, Kalon surged forward. The second guard, sharper than the first, managed a half-gasp before Kelon's massive forearm crushed his windpipe against the stone wall. There was a brief struggle to scrape of boots on stone, the rattle of chainmail before Kalon twisted his hips and snapped the man's neck. Silence returned, heavier than before. The keys, Edric hissed. Kalon rummaged through the second guard's belt, retrieving a heavy iron ring. Got them. But this is too easy, Edric. Voldemar is paranoid. He sees assassins in his soup. Why is the vault lightly guarded? Because he thinks the vault is impenetrable, Edric said, though a seed of doubt began to germinate in his gut. Or because the trap is already sprung. They dragged the bodies into a dark alcove used for storing wine casks and covered them with burlap sacks. Edric led the way deeper, down a spiral staircase that narrowed until their shoulders brushed the walls. The air grew colder, the smell of damp replaced by the sterile scent of dry stone and parchment. They stood before the vault of ciphers. It was a massive door of oak and iron bands, inscribed with the crest of the usurper, a hawk gripping a serpent. Edric stared at the serpent. That was us, he thought. The snake that was meant to be crushed. Do it, Edric commanded. Kalon fumbled with the keys, trying 3 before the 4th slid into the mechanism with a satisfying click. He turned it. The tumblers groaned, ancient and unoiled, echoing loudly in the narrow stairwell. Edric winced at the noise. With a heave, Kalon pushed the door open. The room beyond was not filled with gold. Voldemar did not hoard coin. He hoarded secrets. Rows of shelves lined the walls, stacked high with scrolls, leather-bound ledgers, and map tubes. In the center of the room stood a solitary desk, illuminated by a single magical Gloucester rare luxury imported from the East. And sitting at the desk, facing the door, was not Voldemar. It was a woman. She didn't flinch as the door swung open. She was dressed in the severe grey robes of a scribe, her hair pulled back in a tight braid. A quill hovered over a piece of parchment. She looked up, her eyes calm, terrified, and resigned all at once. "You're late," she said softly. Edric stepped into the room, sword drawn. "Who are you?" "I am Alara, the archivist." She placed the quill down slowly. "Lord Voldemar told me that if I finished the transcription before midnight, I might live. If I didn't, he would skin me. But he also said that if the Ghost of the North arrived, I was to give him a message." Edric approached the desk, the tip of his sword hovering inches from her throat. "Where is he?" "He is not at the feast," Alara said, her voice trembling slightly now. "The man at the high table wearing the hawk crest is a double. A body double paid in gold and promised lands he will never live to see." Kalon cursed from the doorway. "I told you, it was too easy." "Where is Voldemar?" Edric roared, slamming his free hand onto the desk. Ink spilled across the parchment. "He is gone," Alara whispered. "He left an hour ago through the postern gate. He rides for the coastal fortress. He knows you are coming. He has known for weeks." Edric felt the floor tilt beneath him. Weeks. He had been so careful. Every kill had been silent, every movement shrouded. "He left this for you," Alara said, sliding a small, black velvet box across the desk. Edric stared at it. It looked like a coffin for a rat. With the tip of his sword, he flipped the lid open. Inside rested a severed finger. On the finger was a ring silver, set with a rough-cut sapphire. Edric's breath hitched. The rage that usually burned hot and bright in his chest suddenly turned into a block of ice. He knew that ring. It belonged to his brother Torian. Torian, whom he had hidden away in the sanctuary of the monastics, in the High Valley. Torian, who was supposed to be safe. "He raided the monastery 3 days ago," Alara said, tears finally spilling from her eyes. "He wanted you to know that there is no sanctuary," he said. "He said the game ends where it began." Edric picked up the ring. It was cold. He didn't scream. He didn't smash the room. He simply slid the ring onto his own pinky finger, where it sat loose and heavy. "Kalon," Edric said, his voice void of all humanity. "I burn it, the ledger, all of it. Burn the room. Burn the history he thinks gives him power." "And the girl?" Kalon asked, looking at Alara. Edric looked at the scribe. She was shivering. "Run," he he told her. Run as far as you can, and never write another word for a tyrant. Alara didn't need to be told twice. She bolted past Kaelin and up the stairs. Kaelin grabbed a torch from the wall and tossed it onto the pile of scrolls in the corner. The dry parchment caught instantly, curling and blackening as the flames licked upward. "We need to move, Edric," Kaelin urged. "If he knew we were coming, the trap isn't the vault. The trap is the exit." As if on cue, a deep, resonant thud echoed from the hallway. Then another, the sound of heavy shields locking together. "Testudo," Kaelin growled, drawing his Tax house guard. Edric turned away from the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. He didn't feel fear. He felt a terrible clarity. Voldemar had made a mistake. By taking Torian, he had removed Edric's only tether to caution. There was no longer a need to survive for his brother's sake. There was only the need to end it. "Let them come," Edric said. They moved to the doorway. The spiral staircase was blocked. 5 heavy infantrymen, encased in plate armor, were slowly ascending. Their shields locked in a wall of steel, spears protruding like the quills of a porcupine. Behind them, a crossbowman was loading a bolt. "They have the high ground," Kaelin noted. "We can't go up. Then we go down," Edric said. "There is no down. This is the cellar." Edric looked at the floor of the vault. It was paved with large flagstones. "Voldemar is a coward. Cowards always have a back door. Help me with this desk." They shoved the heavy oak desk aside. Beneath it, the flagstones looked undisturbed, but Edric dropped to his knees, his fingers tracing the grout. He found it a slight draft, a hairline crack where the mortar was newer than the rest. Here, above them, the soldiers were closing in. "Surrender," the lead guard bellowed. "Surrender, and you will die quickly." Kaelin laughed, a booming sound that shook the dust from the ceiling. He picked up a heavy ledger stand and hurled it down the stairs. It crashed into the shield wall, staggering the front line but not breaking it. "Come and get us, you Tinken bastards." Edric jammed his dagger into the crack between the stones and pried. The stone groaned but didn't move. "Kaelin, the axe." Kaelin swung his great axe, not at the soldiers, but at the floor. The blade sparked against the stone, shattering the corner of the flagstone. He struck again and again, the steel biting into the rock. On the third strike, the stone cracked in half, revealing a dark void beneath. "A sewer chute. Smells like shit," Kaelin grunted, fitting. The crossbowman at the top of the stairs fired. The bolt whizzed past Idric's ear and shattered a clay ink pot on the shelf. "Go," Idric yelled. Kaelin squeezed his bulk through the hole, dropping into the darkness. A splash echoed up a second later. "It's deep, but it flows." Edric prepared to follow, but he paused. He looked back at the fire consuming the archives. The heat was intense now, the smoke filling the room. He looked at the soldiers who were now at the threshold of the room, wary of the flames. Edric grabbed a bottle of spirits from the scribe's best desk-strong plum brandy and stuffed a rag into the neck. He lit it from the burning scrolls and hurled it at the soldiers. The bottle shattered against the lead shield, bathing the front 2 men in liquid fire. They screamed, breaking formation, flailing as the fire found the gaps in their armor. Edric dropped into the hole. He fell 10 feet, plunging into icy, foul-smelling water. The current was strong, pulling him instantly into the blackness. He surfaced, gasping, the taste of sewage and rot in his mouth. "Kaelin here." A hand grabbed his tunic, hauling him toward a slippery ledge. They were in the castle's drainage system. The water rushed past them, carrying the waste of the feast, above, out to the river. It was pitch black, save for the faint light coming from the hole above, where angry voices and the glow of fire could be seen. "We flushed ourselves like turds," Kaelin spat. "Glorious. We're alive," Edric said, wiping the filth from his eyes. "And we know where he is going." "The coastal fortress," Kaelin asked. "That's 3 days' ride, and he has a head start." "He has an army," Edric corrected. "Armies are slow. We are 2 men, and we have the river." Edric waded into the center of the tunnel, letting the current take him. "We swim to the outlet. We steal horses at the mill. We ride through the weeping woods." "The weeping woods." Kaelin splashed after him. "That's suicide at night." "The wolves." "I have no fear of wolves tonight, Kaelin," Edric said, clutching the ring on his finger. "Tonight, I am the wolf." Scene break. The riverbank, the transition from the suffocating darkness of the sewer to the biting chill of the winter air, was a physical shock. They washed up on the riverbank a mile downstream from the keep. Edric dragged himself onto the frozen mud, shivering uncontrollably. The water had leached the heat from his bones. Blackstone Keep loomed in the distance, a silhouette against the moon. A plume of smoke was rising from the lower levels, the archives burning. Kalen hauled himself out, coughing up river water. That was unpleasant. Edric didn't answer. He was staring at the road that wound along the river. Tracks, fresh ones. A small retinue of horses had passed here recently, moving fast. The mud was churned up. He didn't take the main road, Edric murmured. He took the river path. Why? Speed. He's scared, Kalen. He's running scared. They stripped off their soaked tunics, wringing them out in the freezing air. It was a miserable task, but necessary to avoid freezing to death. As Edric pulled his sodden shirt back on, he noticed the shadow moving in the brush near the tree line. He froze. Down. They dropped into the tall reeds. A patrol of 3 riders emerged from the trees. They weren't house guards. They wore leather armor and carried curved bows. Outriders, mercenaries. They're sweeping the riverbank, Kalan whispered. He really does want to make sure you're dead. Edric watched them. They were moving slowly, scanning the water. They were bored, likely cold, and not expecting resistance this far out. We need horses, Edric said. 3 of them, 2 of us, and we have no bows, Kalen countered. We have darkness. Edric pointed to a cluster of rocks ahead, where the path narrowed. You take the rear. I'll draw them in. Kalen nodded and melted into the reeds, moving with surprising grace for a man of his size. Edric waited until Kalen was in position. Then, he stood up. He stood right in the center of the muddy path, moonlight reflecting off his drawn sword. He looked like a wraith, dripping wet, covered in muck, eyes burning. The lead rider spotted him instantly. Halt. Identity. Edric didn't move. I said halt. The rider unslung his bow, knocking an arrow. The other 2 followed suit. Is that him? One of the riders asked. The one from the bounty. Looks like a drowned rat. The leader laughed. Easy coin. They spurred their horses forward, bows raised, confident in their advantage. They saw a man alone, armed only with a sword, shivering in the cold. They didn't see the massive shape rising from the ditch behind them. Just as the lead rider drew his bowstring to his ear, a roar shattered the night. Kalen launched himself from the reeds, his great axe swinging in a low, brutal arc. The blade caught the rear horse's legs. The beast screamed and collapsed, sending its rider tumbling into the mud. Chaos erupted. The other 2 horses reared, panicked by the noise and the sudden violence. Edric sprinted. He closed the distance to the lead rider in seconds. The mercenary loosed his arrow, but his aim was ruined by the bucking horse. The shaft hissed harmlessly over Edric's shoulder. Edric leaped, grabbing the rider's belt and hauling him out of the saddle. They hit the ground together, a tangle of limbs and mud. The mercenary reached for a dagger, but Edric was faster. He drove his forehead into the man's nose, blinding him with pain, then finished him with a thrust of his short blade under the ribs. He rolled to his feet instantly. Kalen was already finishing his work. The rider he had dismounted was trying to crawl away, clutching a broken leg. Kalen silenced him with a heavy boot. The third rider, seeing his companions decimated in seconds, wheeled his horse around to flee. He can't warn them, Edric shouted. He grabbed the bow dropped by the dead leader. He hadn't fired a bow in years. He was a swordsman, not a hunter, but desperation guided his hand. He snatched an arrow from the quiver on the dead man's hip, knocked it, and drew. The rider was 50 yards away, galloping hard. Edric exhaled, the cloud of breath obscuring his vision for a split second. He released. The arrow didn't hit the rider. It struck the horse in the flank. The animal stumbled, veering sharply into a tree. The rider was thrown, smashing into the trunk with a bone-jarring crack. He didn't get up. Silence returned to the riverbank, save for the heavy breathing of the 2 men and the nervous whinnying of the remaining horses. Messy, Kalen critiqued, wiping his axe on the grass. Effective, Edric replied. He walked over to the horse that belonged to the leader, strong black destrier, well fed and rested. He checked the saddlebags, dried meat, a flask of wine, and a map. He unrolled the map in the moonlight. It was marked with safe houses along the coast. He's not going to the coastal fortress, Edric realized, tracing the line with a bloody finger. That's a decoy. He's heading for the docks at Oakhaven. He's fleeing the country. Kalen joined him, looking at the map. Oakhaven is across the Weeping Woods. If we ride hard, we can cut him off at the pass. We ride until the horses die, Edric said, mounting the black horse, and then we run. Kalen mounted the second horse, and when we catch him, what then? He will have his elite guard with him. Edric looked back at the burning keep one last time. The fire was spreading, a beacon of his failure to save his brother. but also a beacon of his intent. When we catch him, Idrik said, the sapphire ring on his finger catching the moonlight, we don't just kill him, Kalen. We take him apart, piece by piece. He kicked the horse into a gallop. They rode into the dark, leaving the river behind, plunging into the tree line of the Weeping Woods. Segment 15 was over. The infiltration had failed. The target had fled, and the stakes had risen. But the hunt had only just begun. The fire is dying down, traveler, and the shadows of the Weeping Woods grow long. Rest now. The road to Oakhaven is treacherous, and it will still be there when the grey light of dawn breaks the horizon. Unbuckle your sword, let the weight of the journey slide from your shoulders, and find sanctuary in sleep. May your campfire burn bright enough to keep the wolves at bay, and may your dreams be free of the ghosts we left behind in the vault. Ride well when the sun rises. Good night.